Chapter 824. Tao Annihilation. It was not just a realm, but also an attitude towards the universe and all living beings. She knew that after the plain-dressed woman, no one else had reached the Tao Annihilation realm. Even the other two peerless swordsmen had not reached it. Of course, this did not mean that the two swordsmen's realm was lower than the plain-dressed woman's, but the Tao Annihilation realm was exclusive to the plain-dressed woman. This did not mean that others could not reach the Tao Annihilation realm. As long as one had the plain-dressed woman's strength, as well as her domineering ability to look down on everything, they could also reach this realm. Could anyone have the strength of the plain-dressed woman? Yes. The other two swordsmen did. However, the two swordsmen's sword principle was completely different from the plain-dressed woman's sword principle. In particular, the green-robed man's sword principle could be said to be the opposite of the plain-dressed woman's sword principle. The green-robed man's sword principle had too many ties, and it was these ties that formed his sword principle. As for the other swordsman's sword principle, it was a lonely sword principle. It cut off all causes and effects. There was only one sword in his heart, and it was the pinnacle of the sword. This swordsman's sword principle was the purest. As for the plain-dressed woman's sword principle, it was ruthless, but her feelings were only for one person. Apart from this person, she was not ruthless, but she was heartless. There would not be a second plain-dressed woman in this world. The plain-dressed woman did not speak again. Although she was once an enemy of the plain-dressed woman, she had to admit that she was powerful enough to make people despair. The plain-dressed woman looked at Yi Xian with a complicated expression. If this guy in front of her fell, she could not imagine what that woman would do. Not only that woman, but there was also another person. That guy was usually joking and looked harmless, but when he was really angry, his craziness was definitely not inferior to the plain-dressed woman. Thinking of this, the plain-dressed woman suddenly looked at Yi Xian and said softly, "Actually, you're also lucky." Lucky? Yi Xian was a little puzzled. "Senior, what do you mean?" The plain-dressed woman said softly, "Because there are many people who care about you." Yi Xian was silent. A lot of people. In the past he might not have believed it, but now he somewhat believed it. Because along the way he had met many noble people. In fact, he was a little curious about his past life. What kind of existence was he in his previous life? Right at this moment, the woman suddenly said, "We're here." Yi Xian looked up and saw a small bamboo house in the depths of the starry sky. Bamboo house. Yi Xian was just about to speak when the woman suddenly said, "Let's go." Yi Xian nodded. The woman brought Yi Xian to the bamboo house. In front of the bamboo house there was a small pavilion. In the pavilion there was a stone table and two stone stools. On the table there was an unfinished game of chess. The woman walked to the front of the bamboo house. She gently pushed the door open and walked in. Beside her was Yi Xian. Yi Xian looked around and finally he looked at the wall in front of him. There was a woman's portrait floating in the air. Yi Xian was about to speak, but the woman said softly, "Kowtow." Yi Xian was stunned. The woman said again, "Kowtow." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment, then slowly knelt down. At this moment the woman said softly, "She deserves your kowtow and you too should kneel, understand?" Yi Xian asked, "Senior, she is?" Buqingqing Yi Family Ancestral Temple. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent, no virtue? From now on Yi Xian's position as the crown prince will be replaced by Yi Lang. The person who spoke was an old man in a black robe. Not far behind the old man stood a young man, a faint smile hanging on the corner of the young man's mouth. This person was Yi Lang. And on both sides were the Yi family's elders. Why? At this time, a timid voice suddenly sounded in the ancestral temple. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor and she looked a little weak. There was even a trace of fear in her eyes. This little girl was called Yi Ling, Yi Xian's younger sister. This time, when she heard that the family wanted to dismiss Yi Xian, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned. "Yi Ling, what are you doing?" The little girl called Yi Ling bowed to the people in the ancestral temple and said timidly, "Great elder, my brother Yi Xian is the crown prince. Why did you cripple him for no reason?" The great elder looked coldly at Yi Ling. "This is a family matter, why are you interrupting?" Yi Ling was clearly a little fearful. She did not dare to look the great elder in the eye, but she did not leave. Instead, she mustered up her courage and walked into the ancestral hall. She bowed to the elders on both sides of the hall and said, "Elders, my brother is currently fighting with the Li family for the mining rights of the mine in Nanshan. He is now fighting for the family, and it is unknown whether he is alive or dead. However, The family has used a groundless excuse to remove his position as the crown prince. Impudent. The great elder suddenly raged. Whether he's stripped or not, it's not up to a little girl like you to decide. Men drag her away. At this time the new crown prince Yi Lang suddenly laughed. He should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others. The great elder coldly replied, then flog him 30 times. Very quickly 2 Yi family's guards rushed in. Yi Ling clenched her fists and said angrily, this is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the family for so many years and even now he's fighting for the family. The family is unfair to him. One of the guards glanced at the new crown prince Yi Lang. He knew that his chance to shine had come. The guard sneered, young master Yi Lang inherits the title of crown prince. It's everyone's wish. What are you yelling about? As he spoke he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. A crisp slap sounded, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly swelled up. However, she did not cry and only covered her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard and smiled, what's your name? The guard quickly bowed, subordinate Zhang Mu greets the crown prince. Yi Lang nodded, you're not bad. After I become the crown prince I need 10 guards. You can be my guard from now on. Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed and quickly bowed deeply, I'll go through fire and water for the crown prince and I'll do anything for you. Yi Lang nodded, drag him away. This person is causing trouble in the ancestral hall, do not hold back. Understood? Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the killing intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. He immediately grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this time Zhang Mu seemed to have seen something and he suddenly stopped. Within the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. He was wearing a tight-fitting robe that was tattered and covered in blood. This person was Yi Xian, who had rushed back from the Nanshan. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's lips curled into a cold smile. Inside the ancestral hall, all the elders frowned. The great elder narrowed his eyes and his face was dark. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage. Who gave you the guts to touch my sister? When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian, his face changed. He quickly looked at Yi Lang and was about to speak. At this time Yi Xian was like a ferocious tiger leaping in front of him. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Bang! Zhang Mu's head spun and he stumbled and fell. Yi Lang did not stop there and charged towards Zhang Mu again. At this time Yi Lang suddenly roared, Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you? Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly, while Yi Xian lifted his head to look at him, asking savagely, your man? As he spoke, he stomped on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess as he screamed, Prince, save me. Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's state, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being sliced by a knife. He clenched his fists and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, her tears flowed out. Brother, it hurts, it hurts. Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage. In the next instant he charged in front of Zhang Mu and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Qingqing Yi Clan Ancestral Hall. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent, no virtue? From now on Yi Xian's position as prince shall be replaced by Yi Lang. The one who spoke was an old man in black robes. Not far behind the old man, there was a youth with a faint smile on his face. This person was Yi Lang. On both sides there were the elders of the Yi clan. What? Right at this moment, a slightly timid voice suddenly resounded within the ancestral hall. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor and she looked a little weak. There was even a hint of fear in her eyes. This girl was called Yi Ling, and she was Yi Xian's younger sister. When she heard that Yi Xian was to be replaced, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned. Yi Ling, what are you doing? The little girl called Yi Ling bowed to the people in the hall and asked timidly, Great Elder, my brother Yi Xian is the prince. Why did you cripple him for no reason? The Great Elder looked at Yi Ling coldly. This is a matter of the clan, what are you interrupting for? Yi Ling was clearly a little fearful. She did not dare to look the Great Elder in the eye, but she did not leave. Instead, she mustered up her courage and walked into the ancestral hall. She bowed to the elders on both sides of the hall and said, Elders, My brother is currently fighting with the Li family for the mining rights of the mine in Nanshan. He is now fighting for the family, and it is unknown whether he is alive or dead. However, the family has used a groundless excuse to remove his position as the crown prince. Impudent. The great elder suddenly raged. Whether he's stripped or not, it's not up to a little girl like you to decide. Men drag her away. At this time the new prince Yi Lang suddenly laughed. He should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others. The great elder replied coldly, then flog him 30 times. Very quickly 2 Yi clan guards rushed in. Yi Ling clenched her fists and said angrily, "This is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the clan for so many years and even now he's fighting for the clan. The clan is unfair to him." One of the guards glanced at the new prince Yi Lang. He knew that this was his chance to shine. The guard sneered, "Young master Yi Lang inherits the position of prince. What are you yelling about?" As he spoke he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. A crisp slap sounded, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly swelled up. But she did not cry and only held her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard and smiled, "What's your name?" The guard quickly bowed. "This subordinate Zhang Mu greets the prince." Yi Lang nodded, "You're not bad. After I become the prince I need 10 guards. You can be my guard from now on." Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed and quickly bowed deeply. This subordinate is willing to go through fire and water for the prince, even if it means death. Yi Lang nodded, "Drag him away. This person is disturbing the ancestral hall. Don't hold back, understand?" Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the murderous intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. He immediately grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this moment, Zhang Mu suddenly stopped as if he had seen something. In the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. The young man was wearing a tight-fitting robe, and the robe was tattered, and there was blood everywhere. The young man was Yi Xian, who had rushed back from Nanshan. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's mouth curled into a cold smile. In the ancestral hall, the elders frowned. The great elder narrowed his eyes and his face was dark. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage. "Who gave you the guts to touch my sister?" When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian, his face changed. He quickly looked at Yi Lang and was about to speak. At this moment Yi Xian leaped in front of him like a ferocious tiger. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Zhang Mu felt a wave of dizziness and he stumbled and fell. Yi Lang did not stop there and charged towards Zhang Mu again. At this time Yi Lang suddenly roared, "Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you!" Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly, while Yi Xian lifted his head to look at him, asking savagely, "Your man?" As he spoke, he stomped on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess as he screamed, "Prince, save me!" Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's state, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being sliced by a knife. He clenched his fists and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, tears welled up in her eyes. "Brother, it hurts, it hurts." Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage. In the next instant he charged in front of Zhang Mu and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Chapter 825. No way. Hearing the old man's words, the woman nodded and did not say anything else, nor did she attack. In the end Yi Xian had to walk his own path. The old man did not attack either because he could tell that the woman was not in her true form. Since she was not in her true form, how could she stay in this world for too long? Right now he only needed to wait for the woman to disappear. Of course, the reason why he chose to wait was because he did not have any confidence in defeating the woman. The old man took a deep look at the woman in the cloth skirt, and then quietly disappeared. The woman turned to look at the bamboo house in the distance. Her eyes flickered as memories of the past surfaced in her mind. At that moment Yi Xian was still madly absorbing the drop of essence blood. He found that the drop of essence blood was cooperating with him and fusing into his blood. This saved him a lot of trouble. Not far away on the green-robed man's shoulder, the little white fellow looked curiously at Yi Xian before looking at the green-robed man, her eyes filled with curiosity. The green-robed man smiled. "Little fellow, what are you thinking about?" The little white fellow blinked and grinned, then brought the candied fruit to the green-robed man's mouth. The green-robed man took a bite and smiled, "Delicious." The little fellow hugged the green-robed man's head and rubbed it intimately. At the side, the little girl licked the candied fruit and stomped her right foot lightly. She hummed a strange tune, looking very satisfied. As if thinking of something, the little girl suddenly asked, "Brother, when are we going to play at Sister Lian Shuang's house?" Sister Lian Shuang's house. Hearing the little girl's words, the little white fellow quickly looked at the green-robed man, her eyes filled with anticipation. The green-robed man smiled, "We'll go when we're done, all right?" The little girl nodded, "All right." Saying this, she paused and said, "Brother, Sister Lian Shuang's hometown?" The green-robed man smiled and asked, "What is it?" The little girl said, "I borrowed some money from their bank and said that I have to return it within 10 years. I've calculated it and it's about time." The green-robed man smiled, "Are you going back to return the money?" The little girl tilted her head and looked at the green-robed man, her face filled with confusion. "Why should I return it? I borrowed it, not snatched it. What's the point of borrowing money if you have to pay it back?" The azure-robed man, the little girl added, "There's also that platform. I didn't even look for them. They came to me themselves and asked if I was short of money. I said I was, so they lent it to me. Later on they came looking for me and—" At this point she suddenly felt a little angry. These people are really bad. They borrowed 30,000 from me, and now they want me to return 500,000. I asked why and they said it was interest. I asked them what interest was, and they said you have to pay interest when you borrow money. As she spoke, she looked at the green-robed man. "Do I have to pay interest when I borrow money?" The green-clothed man thought for a moment and said, "Have you ever thought about returning the money?" The little girl blinked. "In their world, if you borrow money and don't return it, you will be punished by the law. Moreover, you will be condemned morally and will be despised by others." The green-robed man asked, "Then why didn't you return it?" The little girl was expressionless. "I'm not from their world and in theory, I'm not a human. I've checked and their laws and morals only target humans, not other living beings." The green-robed man, the little girl continued. "I've also checked and in their world some living beings have a lot of special privileges, and they are even more respected than humans. For example, that bear-something cat, its bloodline is many times lower than mine, but it has a very high status in Sister Lian Shuang's hometown. Therefore, I feel that with my status and the rarity of my bloodline, my status in Sister Lian Shuang's hometown should be beyond AAA, so I should be able to borrow money and not return it." At this moment, the little white guy hurriedly pointed at herself. The little girl hurriedly nodded in agreement. "And little white brother, do you know? In Sister Lian Shuang's hometown, the air there is very, very bad, and the pollution there is very serious. Moreover, their food is not very clean. Anyway, I feel that they are quite tenacious, breathing in the harmful air, eating harmful food and still being able to survive. It's not easy." As she spoke, she looked at Little White. After Little White went over, she even gave them a lot of spiritual chi. Now that they are in that place, it's much better. Little White's credit is very big. She should be able to borrow money and not return it. The little white guy hurriedly nodded and then raised both of her paws. She was in full agreement with the little girl's words. The green-robed man asked, "Why didn't you return the money you borrowed?" The little girl shrugged. "I spent it all." The man softly asked, "What did you spend?" The little girl said, "A car with 4 wheels, shiny stones, a big house and that plane. It's something that flies in the sky." As she spoke up to this point, she was a little excited. Then she looked at the green-robed man. "Brother, I bought a fighter jet, the kind that can fight, it's very powerful." The green-robed man frowned slightly. Logically speaking, these things should be very expensive, right? Hearing the green-robed man's words, the little girl hurriedly nodded, feeling a little heartache. Very expensive, very expensive. The green-robed man was a little puzzled. Then why were they willing to lend you so much money? The little girl blinked. "They can't beat me, can they not lend me money?" The green-robed man was speechless. The little girl said again, "Brother, that platform I told you about just now lent me money. After they lent me the money, they lent me 30,000. In the end, they told me that I owed them 500,000. Then they even wanted to tell Ms. N and Ms. Lian Shuang. This made me so angry that I directly smashed their headquarters." The green-robed man said in a deep voice, "Did you hurt yourself?" The little girl shook her head. "No, after I hit them they started to reason with me. Then they told me that I only needed to return 30,000. The green-robed man asked, "And then?" The little girl said, "I borrowed another 3 million. The green-robed man was speechless. At this moment, the little girl suddenly pointed at herself. Arya glanced at the little white guy and then said, "It's not just me. Xiaobai also borrowed 3 million. However, Xiaobai couldn't bear to do it, so she left them a stick of candied hawthorn. It's a little bit of a loss. As she spoke, she shook her head and sighed softly. Actually, I still miss Sister Lian Shuang's place. There are a lot of fun things there. Moreover, you can borrow money from others, the kind that you don't have to return. But here no one lends money to me. The green-robed man shook his head and smiled. Just as he was about to speak, Yi Xian suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes flashed with a red light. The green-robed man looked at Yi Xian. At this moment, Yi Xian stood up and clenched his fists. Boom. The space within hundreds of thousands of feet cracked. Power. The power of the bloodline. Yi Xian greedily took a deep breath. This power was really intoxicating. This was the power that the bloodline gave him. Yi Xian looked at the green-robed man. Thank you, Senior. It could be said that the drop of blood from the green-robed man had brought him an earth-shattering change. The green-robed man smiled. Remember, your bloodline has a special property, and that is, the more irrational you are, the more powerful it becomes. Therefore, don't think about controlling it. It won't hurt you, but you need to be able to control its power. This is what you need to do, not control it. Of course, unless you encounter extreme danger or have no way out, don't use this bloodline so easily. Yi Xian nodded. I understand. Before he had devoured the green-robed man's essence blood, he had already been unable to control the power of the bloodline. Now, after devouring the green-robed man's essence blood, his bloodline could be said to have undergone a qualitative change. He didn't know exactly how strong it was. In any case, he was confident that if he used his bloodline now, he could definitely kill an expert of Li Qinfeng's level. Right now, his bloodline could be said to be his strongest trump card. It was even stronger than the 6 paths of truth in the World Prison Pagoda. The green-robed man smiled slightly. I still need some time. Let's talk about the sword Dao, or rather, sword domain. The sword domain. Yi Xian walked over to the green-robed man and said in a low voice, Senior, what exactly does the sword domain mean? The green-robed man smiled and said, the sword domain is to use the sword to form a domain of your own. To a certain extent, you're invincible within your own domain. Yi Xian was visibly moved when he heard this. It's that formidable? The green-robed man said, it isn't that simple. You have to comprehend it if you want to form a domain with the sword. As he spoke, he opened his palm and a sword appeared there. In the next moment, a strand of mysterious energy appeared here. The sword domain. Yi Xian's expression instantly changed. At this moment he felt like he'd been enveloped by a mysterious force, and he felt like the green-robed man was like a god that couldn't be defeated while being enveloped by this mysterious force. The green-robed man smiled and said, this is a domain formed with the sword. In order to do so, you can utilize your sword intent. Your sword intent is rather special, and it'll be a new type of domain if it's formed. I'm looking forward to it. Yi Xian spoke in a low voice, can I form a domain with the sword as well? The green-robed man nodded, of course. Yi Xian glanced at the green-robed man, hesitated for a moment and then asked, Senior, you aren't in your main body right now, right? The green-robed man grinned, it isn't. We're very far away from you. Yi Xian asked, the 5th dimension? The green-robed man shook his head and smiled, it isn't. Don't think too much about it right now. Cultivate well because you'll have to face many things in the future, and it won't do if you don't possess strength. Yi Xian nodded and didn't ask any further questions. He gazed at the sword in his hand and fell into deep thought. Forming a domain with the sword. Chapter 826. What was a sword domain? Yi Xian did not understand. He did not quite understand. However, he could sense the azure-clothed man's sword domain. This sword domain had opened a new door for him. The sword domain. Yi Xian looked at the azure-clothed man. Senior, I don't know how to comprehend it. The azure-clothed man smiled. It's normal that you don't know. Don't think about asking me to teach you. Only what you comprehend yourself is yours. Comprehend it well and believe in yourself. Yi Xian fell silent. The green-clothed man continued, it's best to have someone to help you while you're alive. However, you shouldn't think of asking for help from others for everything. You shouldn't have this sort of dependence. Because most of the time you can only rely on yourself. A man should work hard to become stronger and be someone else's support. Don't expect others to be your support. Understand? Yi Xian nodded slightly, I understand. The azure-clothed man smiled, comprehend it well. You don't have much time, so don't waste it. With that, he left with the little girl and the little white fellow. As soon as he left, a stream of information suddenly surged into Yi Xian's mind. Some of the azure-clothed man's sword Dao insights. A moment later, Yi Xian sat down and began to ponder. Comprehension. While Yi Xian was comprehending, the azure-clothed man, the little girl, and the little white fellow had already arrived in a starry sky. This was an unfamiliar starry sky. After walking for a while, the azure-clothed man stopped. Not far in front of him was a black vortex, which gave off an eerie aura. Looking at this vortex, the azure-clothed man fell silent. At this moment, a voice came from within. It was not a human voice, and it was unknown what it was saying. A moment later, the azure-clothed man smiled slightly. Is it a predestined fate? After a while, the azure-clothed man turned and left. Time passed bit by bit. During this period of time, what Yi Xian did every day was to comprehend. More accurately, he was absorbing some of the azure-clothed man's sword Dao insights. It had to be said that after absorbing the azure-clothed man's sword Dao insights, he felt enlightened. The direction of his sword Dao became even clearer. Sword domain. His current goal was to cultivate a sword domain. To be precise, he had to use sword intent to assist him in forming a sword domain. As for how to do it, the green-robed man did not tell him. He had to figure it out himself. How could one use the sword to form a domain? This was a problem. The azure-robed man came to the bamboo house, and the little girl and the white fellow walked out without disturbing the azure-robed man. The azure-robed man sat cross-legged in front of the woman's portrait and did not speak for a long time. At this moment, the bamboo door suddenly opened, and the woman in the cloth skirt walked in. The green-robed man smiled. "Long time no see." The woman said softly, "This isn't your main body." The azure-robed man nodded. "It's just an illusion that transcends space-time." The woman said in a low voice, "Are you going to let him live?" The green-robed man said softly, "He can only walk his own path. No one can help him walk it. Humans always have to experience some hardships." The woman said, "You don't intend to tell him about his origins?" The green-robed man shook his head. "The time has not come yet. The current him is still too weak." The woman in the cloth skirt said, "So you left an image here?" The green-robed man nodded. "He is faster than I expected, which is already not bad. Of course, it is still not enough." The woman in the cloth skirt said in a low voice, "There is no one in the fourth dimension who is your opponent, right?" The man smiled and did not speak. The woman in the cloth skirt said again, "But I feel that you are afraid of something." The green-robed man shook his head. "Some things cannot be solved by fighting." After saying this, he turned to look at Yi Xian. "He is too complicated." The woman in the cloth skirt said in a low voice, "His identity is not just that woman's," the green-robed man said softly, "and me. Both of us dare not cut off his past." The woman in the cloth skirt was confused. "What?" The green-robed man looked at the woman in the cloth skirt. "Because we can't cut it off." "Impossible." The woman in the cloth skirt frowned. "Both of you can't cut it off. How is that possible?" The green-robed man said with a smile, "We are not omnipotent. Of course, if he is our enemy, we can kill him with a sword. But the problem is that he is not. So, we cannot use force against him. Even if we use force, we are not confident that we can succeed." The woman in the cloth skirt stared at the green-robed man. "Who is he?" The green-robed man was silent. After a while, the woman in the cloth skirt shook her head and sighed. "It is complicated." The green-robed man nodded. "It is very complicated. His karma cannot be solved with a sword. Otherwise, she and I would have solved it a long time ago." The woman in the cloth skirt said in a low voice, "What is she doing now?" The green-robed man said, "Blocking the karma for him." The woman in the cloth skirt looked at the green-robed man and asked, "What about you?" The green-robed man said with a smile, "I am looking for the source of the karma." The woman in the cloth skirt asked, "Have you found it?" The green-robed man said, "I have some clues." After saying this, he paused and said, "But it is more complicated." The woman in the cloth skirt asked again, "Why?" The green-robed man sighed. "It is a headache." After saying this, he looked at the woman in the cloth skirt and said, "Remember to find me." The woman in the cloth skirt fell silent. The green-robed man was about to speak. Right at this moment, he suddenly raised his head and looked towards where Yi Xian was. In the next moment, he and the woman in the cloth skirt had vanished. In the blink of an eye, both of them had appeared before Yi Xian. At this moment, a mysterious force enveloped Yi Xian's surroundings. Its range was very small, but it existed. A trace of surprise flashed in the green-robed man's eyes. "Interesting," the woman in the cloth skirt asked. "Sword domain?" The green-robed man nodded. "His comprehension isn't bad. He knows how to use sword intent to build up his domain." Even though it isn't a complete sword domain, it has completed the foundation. If he comprehends it in the future, he will be able to form a sword domain. Forming a sword domain. Meanwhile, Yi Xian opened his eyes, and his face was filled with excitement. Senior, have I succeeded? The green-robed man shook his head. It is only the beginning. You have only just grasped the sword domain. Moreover, the range of your sword domain is too small. You can't use it against your enemies yet. Understand? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Then wouldn't it be useless? The green-robed man smiled. How could it be useless? Try activating the sword domain. Yi Xian did as he was told, and he utilized his sword intent to form a small sword domain around him. The green-robed man gazed at the woman in the cloth skirt. Give it a try. The woman nodded. She opened her palm, and then a strand of mysterious force instantly enveloped Yi Xian. The laws of yin and yang. Yi Xian's expression changed. Because the green-robed man within his body said, use the sword domain. Yi Xian hurriedly utilized the sword domain. In an instant, the mysterious force within his body was instantly suppressed. Even though it hadn't vanished completely, the speed at which he aged had been reduced by more than 10 times. Yi Xian was stunned, and then he gazed at the green-robed man. Senior, the green-robed man smiled, this domain counters all laws in the world, and it even includes the Tao laws. Of course, if someone's strength is much greater than yours, then you won't be able to suppress them. However, it isn't to the extent of being unable to fight back. Yi Xian hurriedly nodded when he heard this. Earlier, he wasn't able to resist the woman at all. Not to mention him, even an expert at Li Qinfeng's level wasn't able to fight back before her. Yet now, the sword domain he just cultivated was capable of suppressing these laws. What did this mean? It meant that he could go against numerous experts that were much stronger than him while he possessed the sword domain. At the very least, he wouldn't be unable to fight back at all. The sword domain. What he had to do now was to fully develop this sword domain because it would become a trump card of his. Meanwhile, the green-robed man suddenly smiled. It's time to leave. Yi Xian gazed at the green-robed man when he heard this. Senior, where are you right now? The green-robed man smiled. A place that's extremely far away from you. An extremely far place. Yi Xian was just about to say something when the green-robed man suddenly said, see you in the future. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around to gaze at the woman and grinned, see you in the future. The woman nodded slightly, take care. The green-robed man smiled, and it didn't take long for him, the little girl and the white little fellow to gradually become ethereal. The little girl glanced at Yi Xian and then she waved her hand, remember to bring more candied hawthorn next time. The white little fellow hurriedly waved its little claw to display its agreement. Yi Xian smiled, and then he hurriedly withdrew 2 candied hawthorns and passed them to the little girl and white little fellow. The white little fellow blinked, and then she waved her little claw. A fist-sized white pearl suddenly flew over to Yi Xian. Yi Xian was stunned and he was just about to ask about it. Meanwhile, the green-robed man, the little girl, and the white little fellow had vanished completely. Only Yi Xian and the green-robed woman remained here. The woman fell silent for a short moment before she said, it's time for me to leave as well. Yi Xian gazed at the woman and said, Senior, if I encounter danger in the future. No, if I head to the Nether Pavilion in the future, would I still be able to see all of you? Looking at Yi Xian, the woman in the cotton dress said, you have to walk your own path. Especially in the future, no one will come to help you. Don't have such thoughts of relying on others. When she spoke up to hear, she paused for a moment and said, I'll help you one more time. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and vanished on the spot. Yi Xian was stunned, and then he hurriedly followed her out of the room. The woman arrived in the starry sky, and then she gazed towards the distance. In the next moment, she suddenly opened her right palm and pressed it down lightly. A moment of silence ensued. A sword howl suddenly resounded from afar, and then a ray of light tore through the sky towards them. Yi Xian's expression instantly changed when he saw this attack. It was so formidable that it seemed like it could slash the starry sky into pieces, and it was extremely shocking. Meanwhile, the woman in a cotton dress suddenly pressed down lightly with her right hand, and the ray of sword light instantly vanished without a trace. The old man from the sword sect glanced coldly at the woman, and then he turned around and vanished on the spot. He refused to fight. He knew that the woman was about to vanish. It was extremely stupid to go head-on against her right now. So long as she vanished, then Yi Xian would definitely die. The woman didn't pursue him. The old man from the sword sect wasn't weak, and she had no other choice if he refused to fight her. After all, she couldn't even be considered as a clone. The woman fell silent for a short moment, and then she gazed at Yi Xian. Good luck. As soon as she spoke, her figure instantly became ethereal. Yi Xian was speechless. P.S. Monthly votes are still too few. I fell into deep thought and couldn't figure it out no matter how I thought about it. Chapter 827. The woman in the cotton dress left. Yi Xian knew that he could only rely on himself this time. The sword sect. He had to deal with it himself. Yi Xian looked into the distance. After a moment of silence, he disappeared on the spot. Not long after Yi Xian disappeared, an old man came to the bamboo house. It was the sword sect's old man. The old man gently pushed open the door of the bamboo house. However, the moment he opened the door, a sword light suddenly flew out of the bamboo house. The sword sect's old man's pupils shrank. In the next moment he suddenly pulled out the sword at his waist and slashed. Boom. The sword sect's old man flew tens of thousands of feet away in an instant. After stopping, the sword sect's old man looked at the bamboo house with a face full of disbelief. Swordsman? It was a swordsman who repelled him just now. And there was such a powerful swordsman in the four-dimensional universe? It must be known that the most powerful swordsmen in the four-dimensional universe were all from the sword sect. The sword attack just now was definitely not from the sword sect's swordsman. Of course, this was not the key point. The key point was that he could not withstand that sword attack just now. The sword sect's old man stared at the bamboo house. May I ask who you are, Your Excellency? There was no response. After a moment of silence, the sword sect's old man took a deep look at the bamboo house and then turned to leave. It turned out that there was always someone better out there. After Yi Xian left the bamboo house, he used the Infinite Sword's clear realm to secretly return to the dual realm sky. He definitely could not return to the Black-Yellow Great World now because the Black-Yellow Great World could not withstand the sword sect's attacks. He must now unite with the dual realm sky to fight against the sword sect. Grand Elder Qin and Qin Shi welcomed Yi Xian's arrival. They needed Yi Xian now because it would be very difficult for the dual realm sky to fight against the sword sect alone. With Yi Xian's help, it would be very beneficial for the dual realm sky. Because Yi Xian was strong enough and the person behind him was strong enough. In the clouds, Grand Elder Qin glanced at Yi Xian and smiled. Little friend, I haven't seen you for a few days. Your strength has grown a lot again. Yi Xian smiled. Compared to Senior, I'm still lacking a lot. Grand Elder Qin shook his head. With young friend's talent, your future achievements will definitely far surpass mine. Yi Xian smiled and then he said, Senior, how should we resist the sword sect now? Yi Xian said. Great friend, sword sect's great sect. Xian, Senior, Yi great friend, don't worry, if it's in your hands we won't have any other thoughts. Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Senior, you don't believe me? You saw it with your own eyes. Jiang Qi took it away. Tell me, how can I snatch it from the hands of the sword sect's experts? Grand Elder Qin looked at Yi Xian and didn't say anything. Yi Xian said, Senior, the sword sect said that the treasure is in my hands because they want to sow discord between me and the dual realm sky. Senior should understand this. He naturally wouldn't admit that the world prison pagoda was in his hands. He knew very well that even though the people of the dual realm sky were treating him amiably, if they knew that the world prison pagoda was in his hands, they would be even crazier than the sword sect. Friendship? He didn't have any friendship with the dual realm sky. If he hadn't tricked the people of the dual realm sky into thinking that the treasure was in the hands of the sword sect, the dual realm sky wouldn't have let him off. There was no friendship between him and these people, only benefits. Therefore, he wasn't naive enough to think that these people would really become friends with him. Grand Elder Qin was silent for a moment. He slowly unclenched his fists and smiled. I naturally understand. The sword sect is malicious, so we naturally won't fall for their tricks. However, if the treasure is in the hands of the sword sect, why are they still chasing after you? Yi Xian glanced at Grand Elder Qin. This guy wasn't easy to fool. Yi Xian collected his thoughts and smiled. I also asked the sword sect leader. The answer he gave me was to cut the weeds and eliminate them by their roots. Cut the weeds and eliminate them by their roots. Hearing this, Grand Elder Qin understood. If he became enemies with a genius like Yi Xian, he definitely had to cut the weeds and eliminate them by their roots. Otherwise, a monstrous genius of this level would definitely pose a threat to the sword sect in the future. Thinking of this, Grand Elder Qin smiled. Don't worry, my young friend. The sword sect is powerful, but the dual realm sky isn't afraid of them. Yi Xian said in a low voice, Senior, you know that the treasure is in the hands of the sword sect. If the sword sect completely controls it, then we, at this point his face became solemn. We must have a countermeasure. Otherwise what awaits us is a slow death. Grand Elder Qin fell silent. Yi Xian said again, we really can't just sit here and wait for our doom. Grand Elder Qin nodded. You're right. What do you think we should do? Yi Xian said in a low voice, I want to know how many people we have right now. Grand Elder Qin said, 42. Yi Xian asked again, how strong are they? Grand Elder Qin said, the weakest is in the life realm and there are 6 in the life-breaking realm. Hearing this, Yi Xian's eyelids twitched. What a terrifying lineup. At this time, Grand Elder Qin said, the sword sect is not easy to deal with, especially the sect leader of the sword sect. That person's strength may have reached the peak of seeking Dao or even the edge of entering Dao. Plus, he's a swordsman, so his combat strength is extremely powerful. When he spoke up to here, he paused for a moment and said, besides him, there's another old fellow in the sword sect. He's called Jian Mu, and he's the master of Li Qinfeng and Mu Qingfeng. He's still alive, and if it's in a one-on-one battle, then none of us are a match for his combat strength. Yi Xian frowned slightly. Is there no one in the dual realm sky? Grand Elder Qin shook his head. Of course there are people in the dual realm sky who can fight him, but these people, Yi Xian asked, they won't do anything? Grand Elder Qin nodded. At least for now they have no intention of doing anything. Hearing this, Yi Xian understood. Compared to the sword sect, the biggest shortcoming of the dual realm sky was that the sword sect was a group. Everyone had a sense of belonging and was very united. In the past, everyone in the dual realm sky did things their own way and played their own games. Thus they could not be as united as the sword sect. Although they had already gathered, the true superpowerhouses of the dual realm sky had yet to declare their position. This was the most fatal. If the sword wasn't restrained by anyone, this person alone would be able to sweep away many experts in the dual realm sky. Grand Elder Qin continued, what we fear the most right now is Mu Qingfeng and Jian Mu. Saying this, he looked at Yi Xian. I wonder if the people behind you can restrain Jian Mu and Mu Qingfeng? The people behind him? Yi Xian was silent. He did not even have a hair on his back right now. Of course he could not say that. If he did, his weight in the dual realm sky would decrease. Yi Xian thought about it, then said, to tell you the truth, the people behind me have already fought Jian Mu. Hearing this, Grand Elder Qin narrowed his eyes. How is it? Yi Xian said in a low voice, Jian Mu does not dare to fight her for real. Grand Elder Qin said in a low voice, where is she now? Yi Xian shook his head. Only her clone came. Her real body is in a faraway place. Clone. Hearing this, Grand Elder Qin's expression changed slightly. He did not think that Yi Xian was lying because Li Qinfeng was dead. Could anyone who could kill Li Qinfeng be ordinary? Grand Elder Qin asked again, can she come in person? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Senior, if she could come in person, I would have fought my way to the sword sect long ago. However, I've already contacted her. As for when she will come, even I don't know. Grand Elder Qin sighed softly. Then this matter will be slightly difficult to deal with. Yi Xian said, can the experts of our dual realm sky act? Grand Elder Qin looked at Yi Xian. We've already contacted them, but they haven't responded. Yi Xian thought about it and said, should I try? Grand Elder Qin glanced at Yi Xian and then he said, that's fine. Yi Xian nodded. We have to try. Grand Elder Qin said, come with me. Both of them were about to move. Right at this moment, the howl of a sword resounded from the distant horizon. Grand Elder Qin's expression changed. Jian Mu. Let's go. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and vanished. Yi Xian glanced at the horizon and then he followed. Grand Elder Qin brought Yi Xian to the depths of a mountain range. The two of them came to a valley. In the valley there was a small hut. In front of the hut, an old man was lying on a chair. The old man was dressed in hemp clothes and trousers, and there was a small wine gourd in front of his chest. Grand Elder Qin, who was beside Yi Xian, said solemnly, Wine Emperor, go and try. Remember, don't mention the word wine, and don't try to be clever and give him wine. In any case, don't mention anything related to wine. Don't ever mention it. Yi Xian was puzzled. Why? Grand Elder Qin shook his head slightly. I don't know. In any case, don't mention it. Yi Xian nodded slightly. All right. Grand Elder Qin looked at Yi Xian. Jian Mu's target should be you. I'll go stall him. We must convince him. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned and left. In the same place, Yi Xian was silent for a moment, and then he walked towards the Wine Emperor. The latter was snoring loudly. Yi Xian thought for a moment and then said, "Does Senior want to understand the fifth-dimensional treasure in the fifth-dimensional universe?" The Wine Emperor suddenly opened his eyes and looked at Yi Xian. His eyes were calm, but there was a formless pressure emanating from them. Yi Xian smiled and said, "Senior is interested in the fifth dimension." The Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian. "Speak." Yi Xian said, "That pagoda not only allows people to go to the fifth dimension, it also contains the Tao laws and laws of the fifth dimension. These laws and laws are higher than the fourth dimension. If Senior obtains it, I believe that with Senior's strength, these laws and Tao laws will be of great help to Senior." The Wine Emperor looked deeply at Yi Xian. "Young man, you want the old man to help you deal with the sword sect?" Yi Xian nodded. "Yes. However, there is also a reward. If Senior obtains that pagoda, I believe that it will be of great help to Senior." The Wine Emperor shook his head. "That pagoda is not in the hands of the sword sect." Yi Xian was stunned. Just as he was about to speak, the Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian. "That pagoda is still in your hands." Yi Xian said in a deep voice. "Senior, that pagoda is really not in my hands." The Wine Emperor shook his head. "I admire you. I admire that a swordsman like you can be so shameless." Yi Xian. Chapter 828. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, the Wine Emperor continued, "Young man, the old man used to play the same tricks you played. You used the greed of the two realm skies experts to help you deal with the sword sect. As for the sword sect, because they looked down on you, they were tricked by you again and again. Now they no longer look down on you, but they've discovered that you're even more monstrous than they imagined. Especially the person behind you. A person who could easily kill Li Qinfeng is definitely not weaker than Jian Mu." Then he looked at Yi Xian. "Do you know why the other old guys and I didn't expose you? Do you know why?" Yi Xian fell silent. The Wine Emperor said softly, "Because we don't want to get involved in your matters. We also want the treasure of the fifth dimension, but you're too complicated. Especially the person behind you, we don't want to provoke him." At their level, they could already understand some of Dao Yi's karma. They were very clear that killing Yi Xian wasn't difficult. What was difficult was, after killing him, what would happen to the treasure? Could they defend it? The answer was no. Although the treasure was good, it was too troublesome. It wasn't time for them to stake everything on one throw, so they didn't want to be tainted by the karma of this treasure. The stronger one was, the more reverence one had for karma. Yi Xian fell silent for a moment, then said, "Senior, let's make a deal." The Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian, not saying anything. Yi Xian smiled slightly. "If Senior doesn't want to understand the fifth dimension, just pretend I didn't say anything." He turned and left. At that moment, a mysterious force suddenly locked onto Yi Xian. Yi Xian stopped and the Wine Emperor said, "Tell me about it." Yi Xian turned to look at the Wine Emperor. "The fifth dimension focuses on space-time, karma, reincarnation. What they're pursuing now is completely different from us. What we're learning now is what they left behind." As he finished speaking, he opened his palm, revealing the Tao of space in his palm. Yi Xian clenched his fist gently and the space Tao law trembled slightly. Very soon, the surrounding space started to reorganize itself layer by layer. The space Tao law of the four-dimensional universe was completely useless and could not stop his space Tao law from reorganizing the space here. Soon, the surrounding space was reorganized into a strange shape. The Wine Emperor looked around, a trace of doubt in his eyes. Slowly, that doubt turned into confusion. After a long time, the Wine Emperor said, "Can you let me study this thing?" Yi Xian looked at the Wine Emperor, not saying a word. The Wine Emperor naturally understood what Yi Xian meant. Just as he was about to speak, a beam of sword light pierced through the skies, slashing towards Yi Xian. Yi Xian had no intention of making a move. The Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian, not intending to make a move. Just as the sword light was about 10 feet away from Yi Xian's head, the Wine Emperor suddenly opened his palm and waved it lightly. Boom! The sword light was forced to stop in its original spot, only 10 inches away from Yi Xian. At this moment, an old man walked over from the side. It was the sword sect's Jinmu. Clearly, Grand Elder Chen and the rest had not stopped him. Jinmu did not care about Yi Xian. Instead, he looked at the Wine Emperor in front of Yi Xian. "Wine Emperor, are you going to interfere in this matter?" The Wine Emperor looked at Jinmu. 1 month. I'll protect him for 1 month. Give me 1 month's time. 1 month. Jinmu shook his head. No. There were too many variables in 1 month. Especially Yi Xian. Yi Xian's growth speed was too terrifying. In 1 month, who knew how much Yi Xian would grow? Time was a variable. To Yi Xian there were too many possibilities in 1 month. The Wine Emperor fell silent. At this moment, Jianmu looked at the Wine Emperor. Brother Wine Emperor, in the past, you and I could be considered to have a bit of friendship. You should also know exactly who has the treasure. Can you give me some face and not interfere in this matter? The Wine Emperor was silent for a moment. Finally, he sighed and turned to leave. He still chose not to interfere. He was very tempted, but once he interfered, it meant that he would become enemies with the sword sect. He really did not want to be dragged into this whirlpool. Less quarrel, less karma. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly said, "Senior, the person behind me is from the 5th dimension." Hearing this, the Wine Emperor turned to look at Yi Xian. Jinmu also turned to look at Yi Xian. The 5th dimension. They all knew that there was someone behind Yi Xian, but they had never thought about it in the direction of the 5th dimension. The person behind him was from the 5th dimension? It had to be said that this shocked both of them. The Wine Emperor stared at Yi Xian. "You said that the person behind you is from the 5th dimension?" Yi Xian nodded, "Yes." The Wine Emperor stared at Yi Xian. "I don't believe it. How could someone from the 5th dimension come down?" At this point, he seemed to have thought of something and his pupils shrank. "The person behind you followed your tower here." Yi Xian nodded, "Yes." At this point he looked at Jinmu. "Do you know why you can't find out anything about the person behind me? Because he is not a 4th dimension expert. So, even if you use all your resources, you won't be able to find him." Jinmu stared at Yi Xian, not saying anything. Yi Xian didn't care about Jinmu. Instead, he looked at the Wine Emperor beside him. "Senior Wine Emperor, as long as you're willing, you can have a good understanding of the 5 dimensions. I believe that if you talk to the person behind me, you'll definitely be greatly enlightened. You might even reach a higher level. This might be your only chance in this lifetime." The Wine Emperor narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Yi Xian smiled. "Because don't think of trying to barge into the 5th dimension. That is absolutely impossible. Their strength far exceeds your imagination. Barging in forcefully is undoubtedly courting death." At this point he paused, then said, "Senior should have barged in before, so you should know whether what I said is true or false." The Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian. "Why did the person behind you come to the 4th dimension?" Clearly he believed Yi Xian's words. Yi Xian smiled. "I also asked about this, but he didn't tell me. He only said that he would tell me in the future. Moreover, he warned me not to try barging into the 5th dimension. Because, unless we have the strength of a 5th dimension expert, trying to barge in would only be sending us to our deaths." The Wine Emperor raised his head, looked at the horizon and said softly, "Is the 5th dimension really that powerful?" Yi Xian said, "It is much more powerful than we imagined. However, I have a way to enter." The Wine Emperor looked at Yi Xian. "Barge in?" Yi Xian shook his head. "No, I will go in openly." At the side, Jinmu suddenly said, "You finally admit that the pagoda is in your hands?" Yi Xian smiled coldly. "Isn't it in your hands?" He would definitely not admit it even if he was beaten to death. If he admitted it, he would be finished. Even if everyone knew that it was in his hands, he could not admit it. In any case, he would not admit it. Jinmu coldly looked at Yi Xian, not saying a word. At the side, the Wine Emperor suddenly asked, "Then why don't you and the person behind you go to the 5th dimension?" Yi Xian smiled. "I also want to, but the time is not right now. Before Junior, if you are willing, I can let the other party talk to you. Perhaps it will be of great help to you." The Wine Emperor fell silent. Jinmu slowly clenched his right hand. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, Jinmu suddenly attacked. This sword was extremely fast. However, just as he attacked, Yi Xian's entire body disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already hundreds of feet away. Yi Xian turned his head. Not far from him, a middle-aged man slowly walked over. The middle-aged man wore a long black robe and held a folding fan in his hand. His entire person was elegant and refined. The person who had helped him just now was this middle-aged man. Emperor Shi. Jinmu looked at the middle-aged man walking over, his face somewhat gloomy. Emperor Shi ignored Jinmu and looked at Yi Xian instead. He smiled and said, "Little friend, the Wine Emperor is not willing to protect you, but I am. However, only for a month. After all, the karma on you is too great. I do not have the ability to protect you for a lifetime." Yi Xian thought about it, then said, 1.5 months. Emperor Shi glanced at Yi Xian. "Sure." At the side, Jinmu suddenly said, "Emperor Shi, let's exchange a few moves." Emperor Shi nodded, "Sure. I haven't fought in a long time, and my hands just happen to be itching. Let's give it a try." "Ah." Jinmu looked at Emperor Shi. "As you wish." Luo Shi's voice rang out and the two of them vanished on the spot. Yi Xian looked up. Above the clouds, the faint sounds of battle could be heard. At the side, the Wine Emperor suddenly said, "Yi Xian, is the person behind you really from the fifth dimension?" Yi Xian glanced at the Wine Emperor and nodded. "Yes." The Wine Emperor said, "Can I talk to him?" Yi Xian did not speak. "Talk." If it weren't for Emperor Shi who had just appeared, he would probably be dead by now. This old man only wants benefits and doesn't want to do anything. He's even more shameless than me. The Wine Emperor wanted to say something, but at this moment, two people suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. It was Jinmu and Emperor Shi. Emperor Shi laughed. "Brother Jinmu, I will protect this person for 1.5 months. Farewell." As soon as he finished speaking, he took Yi Xian and vanished. In the battlefield, Jinmu's expression was somewhat ugly. It wasn't that he didn't lose to Emperor Shi, but he couldn't win either. As long as he couldn't kill Emperor Shi, he couldn't do anything to Emperor Shi. At the side, the Wine Emperor's expression was somewhat ugly as Yi Xian thought that he might have missed something. Sometimes when doing things one really couldn't be afraid. One had to be decisive. Perhaps one would fight until one's head bled, but there might also be a new opportunity. For experts of their level, it was hard to come by an opportunity to change one's destiny even in 1,000 years. Of course he didn't want to give up just like that. After a moment, the Wine Emperor turned and disappeared. In the battlefield, Jinmu's expression was extremely gloomy. Now that Yi Xian had Emperor Shi's protection, it was impossible for him to kill Yi Xian within 1.5 months. Many things could really happen in 1.5 months. He couldn't wait. Jinmu looked coldly into the distance, then turned and left. Somewhere in the clouds, Emperor Shi smiled and said, "Little friend, I have something to ask you." Yi Xian asked. "But..." Emperor Shi looked at Yi Xian. "Is that treasure on you?" Yi Xian was silent for a moment. Just as he was about to speak, Emperor Shi suddenly grinned. "I already know the answer." As soon as he finished speaking, a powerful pressure suddenly enveloped Yi Xian. The next moment, his soul directly surged into the space between Yi Xian's eyebrows. P.S. Here's a red packet for everyone. Remember to snatch it. Chapter 829. Did Emperor Shi want to possess him? This was Yi Xian's first thought, but he soon discovered that this was not the case. Emperor Shi had directly entered the world prison pagoda within his body, using his soul. However, as soon as he entered, he was forcefully thrown out by the world prison pagoda. In front of Yi Xian, Emperor Shi's soul returned. He looked at Yi Xian with a serious look in his eyes. "Is that the fifth-dimensional treasure?" Yi Xian nodded. "Yes." Emperor Shi looked at Yi Xian and smiled apologetically. "Little friend, I have no ill intentions. I just know your personality. If I didn't do this, you wouldn't have admitted that the fifth-dimensional treasure was on you." Yi Xian was speechless. Emperor Shi smiled again. "I have to say, the sword sect has underestimated you too much." As he said this, he looked around. "Little friend, let's talk somewhere else." After saying this, he disappeared with Yi Xian. After a while, Yi Xian and Emperor Shi came to the depths of a bamboo forest. In this bamboo forest there was a small wooden house. The wooden house was not big, but it was very exquisite. Emperor Shi brought Yi Xian into the bamboo house. He brewed a pot of tea and smiled. "Little friend, have some tea." Yi Xian smiled and said, "Thank you." Emperor Shi said softly, "Little friend, you brought this fifth-dimensional treasure to this place. You are very bold." Yi Xian shook his head. "I have no choice." If he had a choice, he also wanted to develop in peace and work hard to become stronger. However, others would not give him a chance. Emperor Shi smiled slightly and said, "Little friend, you may not know what the fifth-dimensional treasure on you means to us." As he said this, he looked outside the bamboo door and said softly, "When I first came here, I thought that with my strength I could completely break through the fifth dimension. However, I was wrong. After a few attempts, I almost lost all hope." Yi Xian said in a low voice, "Is it very difficult?" Emperor Shi smiled bitterly. "It is not just difficult. It is almost impossible. The higher you go, the closer you are to the fifth dimension, the more despair you will feel." Speaking up to here, he looked at Yi Xian. "Therefore, to us, your fifth-dimensional treasure is like a flame that has suddenly appeared in the middle of an endless night. Of course, some people are still watching from the sidelines because they are truly afraid of the person behind you." Yi Xian said, "Senior, there's something I don't understand." Emperor Shi smiled and asked, "What is it?" Yi Xian said softly, "Do you guys like going to the fifth dimension so much?" Emperor Shi laughed and said, "Little friend, what you said is a little too easy for you to say. You haven't reached our level yet, so you won't be able to understand the feelings and circumstances of people like us. For us, we either advance further or wait for death. Tell me, what will we do? Yi Xian nodded. Understood. Miss Lian Qian, he said softly. As soon as he finished speaking, Lian Qian appeared in the bamboo house. When he saw Lian Qian, Emperor Shi was slightly stunned. Then he asked, "This is?" Yi Xian smiled and said, "She is the law of this tower. She comes from the fifth dimension." Emperor Shi looked at Lian Qian and nodded slightly. "Miss, please enlighten me." Lian Qian looked at Yi Xian and Yi Xian nodded. Lian Qian asked, "What do you understand about space?" Emperor Shi pondered for a moment, then said, "Space is the world we live in. It is formed in a special way." Lian Qian said, "Matter. Everything is made up of matter. Most of the strong people in the fourth dimension know this. However, you can't use more vivid words to define it. Space is the objective situation of the existence of matter. It is represented by length, width, height, size, and size. Strictly speaking, you guys are still in the three-dimensional space. However, because some of the strong people in your world can change space and make it exist in another form, it can barely be called the fourth dimension, but..." At this point, she paused for a moment before continuing, "The people of this universe only have this much understanding of space. For example, Your Excellency is so powerful that you know that space is made up of matter. However, do you know what matter is made up of?" Emperor Shi shook his head. "I don't know." Lian Qian said softly, "Your current understanding is only at the level of matter. Moreover, you haven't even understood this level of matter." Emperor Shi was silent for a moment, then asked, "Miss, what level would I be at if I go to the fifth dimension?" Lian Qian glanced at Emperor Shi and shook her head. "With your strength, even if you go to the fifth dimension, you won't be considered too weak. However, you won't be able to reach the fifth dimension. Even if you do, you will die." Emperor Shi frowned slightly. "Why?" Yi Xian looked at Lian Qian. This was also what he was puzzled about. Lian Qian said softly, "The first obstacle is the prohibition that Master once set. With your strength, you won't be able to withstand that prohibition. Even if you can withstand it, your physical body will be destroyed. The second obstacle is that the people of the fifth dimension don't really welcome the people of the fourth dimension. When Master was still around, the fifth dimension wasn't so chaotic. However, many people were still ambitious. Therefore, Master directly set up that prohibition. His real purpose was not to restrict you guys from the fourth dimension, but to protect your universe. Unfortunately, the people of your universe are thinking of ways to destroy this prohibition." Emperor Shi said softly, "Miss, have you ever thought that the prohibition also restricts us?" Lian Qian shook her head. "Without that prohibition, your fourth dimension can't survive. There are wars in every world, and the fifth dimension is not something you guys can fight against." Speaking of this, she glanced at Emperor Shi and said, "However, you guys won't care about the life and death of the fourth dimension, right?" Emperor Shi smiled slightly and didn't speak. Lian Qian shook her head and sighed. "Of course, I also understand you guys. After reaching a certain level, if you can't go further, you will definitely be very unwilling. However, actually, if you can reach the limit of your fourth dimension, you don't need to go to the fifth dimension. Or rather, if you want to go to the fifth dimension, it won't be difficult." Emperor Shi's eyes narrowed slightly. "The limit of the fourth dimension? Miss, what do you think is the limit of the fourth dimension?" Lian Qian said softly, "You want to say that you guys have reached the limit of the fourth dimension, right?" Emperor Shi smiled slightly. "Even if it isn't the limit of the fourth dimension, it shouldn't be far off." Lian Qian shook her head. "You guys are too far off." Emperor Shi looked at Lian Qian and didn't speak. Lian Qian was expressionless. "You don't believe me?" Emperor Shi smiled slightly. "Indeed, I don't believe you." Lian Qian looked at Yi Xian. "Show him the sword at the top of the pagoda." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He took out a sword. This sword was the sword of the plain-dressed woman. When he saw this sword, Emperor Shi suddenly stood up. His face was full of disbelief. This is a common sword. A real common sword." Speaking of this, he looked at Yi Xian. "Whose sword?" Yi Xian thought for a moment, then said, "It's my master's sword." "Master." Emperor Shi's pupils shrank slightly. "Your master?" As he said this, he sat down and murmured, "No wonder. No wonder." Yi Xian glanced at Emperor Shi. He could tell that Emperor Shi was very shocked. In other words, even in this place, the mortal realm should be considered very, very rare. At this time, Emperor Shi said softly, "A common sword-level swordsman has never appeared in the dual realm sky. The sword sect has never appeared either. We always thought it was a legend, but I didn't expect it to really exist. Speaking of this, he looked at Yi Xian with a complicated expression. I finally understand why you can live until now. Common Sword's master. This backer, Emperor. She shook his head and sighed. This sword sect. Speaking of this, he seemed to have thought of something. He looked at Yi Xian. Can your master enter the fifth dimension? I mean barge in by force, not by relying on this external object. Lian Qian said, yes. Emperor. She looked at Lian Qian. She said softly, that's why I said that if you can reach the limit of the fourth dimension, it will not be worse than the fifth dimension. You really don't need to pin all your hopes on this pagoda. If you use this pagoda to go to the fifth dimension, you won't be able to survive. The people of the fifth dimension want this treasure more than you do. If you bring this treasure there, you will really be seeking death. After a moment of silence, Emperor. She said softly, I understand. Lian Qian nodded and did not say anything else. After a moment, Emperor. She suddenly looked at Yi Xian. Little friend, can you lend me your Space Dao Law to study? Yi Xian smiled and said, of course. After saying this, he flicked his finger, and the Space Dao Law landed in front of Emperor Shi. Emperor Shi nodded slightly. Thank you. After saying this, he looked at the Space Dao Law in front of him and fell into deep thought. Meanwhile, Yi Xian and Lian Qian got up and left. At this moment, Emperor Shi suddenly said, little friend, please don't leave this place. Otherwise, I will not be able to guarantee your safety. Yi Xian nodded. All right. After saying this, he left the bamboo house with Lian Qian. Outside the bamboo house, Yi Xian looked up at the sky and said softly, 1.5 months. Lian Qian looked at Yi Xian. You have to make some preparations. Yi Xian looked at Lian Qian. Prepare for what? Lian Qian said softly, I have a hunch that you may be entering the fifth dimension. Entering the fifth dimension. Yi Xian was silent. In fact, he also had this feeling. He had not reached the end of the fourth dimension, but he was close. The fifth dimension? That was an unfamiliar universe. Yi Xian shook his head and did not think too much about it. It was useless to think about it. How to improve his strength was the most important thing. As if thinking of something, Yi Xian suddenly took out the Executing Heaven sword. The next moment, he directly used Sword Intent to activate the Sword Domain. Miss Lian Qian, do you have any suggestions? Sword Domain. What he wanted the most now was to cultivate this Sword Domain. After a moment of silence, Lian Qian said, are you willing to try? Yi Xian nodded. Of course I am. Lian Qian said in a low voice, that man in green Sword Domain is very strong. Not to mention the laws and Dao laws of this world, it can even suppress the laws and Dao laws of the fifth dimension. It's impossible for you to achieve what he did in a short period of time. Moreover, I feel that there is no need for you to take his path. After saying this, she looked at Yi Xian. I will use my knowledge of the fifth dimension to help you create a completely new Sword Domain. Chapter 830. A brand new Sword Domain. Yi Xian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Lian Qian gazed at Yi Xian. In layman's terms, a domain is equivalent to establishing a small independent world in the fifth dimension. In this small world, you're the master. However, this small world must be sufficiently powerful. When she spoke up to here, she paused slightly before she continued. Now you have to do 2 things. Firstly, strengthen this sword domain so that it can be utilized against your enemies. Secondly, fuse everything you've learned in the past into this sword domain. Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. Fuse? Oh. Lian Qian said, right now your strongest trump cards are your bloodline power, Master Samsara Mantra, the immeasurable sword, and the sword domain that you just comprehended. Secondly, you have your good and evil sword intent, Space Dao Law, Dream Dao Law, and Grand Dao Law. Besides that, there's also your swords. You have 4 swords that are at the peak of the 4th dimension. At this point, she gazed at Yi Xian. If you use Master's 6 paths of truth to suppress your opponent in your sword domain, then activate your bloodline power, and finally execute the infinite sword with 4 swords that combine into one, what do you think will happen? Yi Xian was stunned when he heard this. What will happen? Yi Xian replied immediately, I will die. He'd never used it like this before, nor did he dare to use it. Because each of these trump cards was more terrifying than the last. If he were to use them all at once, it would naturally be destructive, but he would be finished as well. How could he endure it? Lian Qian nodded. I know. So, we have to think of a way to solve this problem. Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. What is it? Lian Qian replied, there are 2 ways. The first is for you to learn how to control it. Yi Xian spoke abruptly. If I activate my bloodline, then I won't be able to control it. Lian Qian fell silent when she heard this. Just as Yi Xian had said, once he activated his bloodline, what else would he be able to control? The crazier he was, the stronger he would be. Lian Xian said, then we can only use the second method. Yi Xian looked at Lian Xian. What is it? Lian Xian said solemnly, use this pagoda to protect your heart and soul. Let it withstand the backlash. Yi Xian was stunned. Is this okay? Lian Xian nodded. Sure. Yi Xian asked in a low voice, will this hurt it? Lian Xian shook her head. You're underestimating this pagoda. With your current strength it's hard for you to damage it. However, at this point she stopped as if she had some misgivings. Yi Xian asked, but what? Lian Xian said in a low voice, what I'm worried about is that even it can't really protect you. Your bloodline is too terrifying, especially after you devoured that green-robed man's blood. Even I can't estimate your current bloodline power. Yi Xian nodded. Not to mention Lian Xian, even he himself did not know what level his bloodline had reached. If it was as Lian Xian had said, he could use the 6 paths of truth in the sword domain, then activate the power of his bloodline and use the boundless sword with the executing heaven sword, how terrifying would it be? Yi Xian couldn't estimate it. He really couldn't, because it was too terrifying. Of course, the backlash would definitely be extremely powerful as well. Meanwhile, Lian Xian said, you can practice it now. Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Miss Lian Xian, once I activate my bloodline, I won't be able to stop. Lian Xian nodded. I know. What I mean is, you don't have to activate your bloodline now. Just activate the sword domain and execute the 6 paths of truth and the boundless sword within the sword domain. Also, remember to use the space Tao law to stabilize the space within the sword domain and the earth energy to stabilize the space within yourself. Otherwise, the space will collapse and you'll suffer the backlash of the space energy. Yi Xian glanced at the surroundings. Try it here? Lian Xian nodded. Yes. Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he nodded and started activating the sword domain. As soon as it appeared, he instantly felt as if he was an overlord. That sort of feeling and confidence was something he'd never felt in the past. Yi Xian didn't give it any further thought. He withdrew the executioner heaven sword and closed his eyes slowly. In the next moment he suddenly opened his eyes. A blood-red prisoner character had suddenly appeared in the distant horizon, and the sky had instantly darkened. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly drew his sword and slashed. The boundless sword. An unparalleled martial technique from the 5th dimension. As soon as this sword strike was executed, a rift suddenly split open in the distant horizon. After a moment of silence, the entire horizon turned pitch black, and only the blood-red prisoner character remained. Obliterated. That expanse of space was obliterated, and even the space Tao law of the 4th dimension was unable to repair it. Simply speaking, that expanse of space had vanished completely. Meanwhile, Yi Xian's body instantly felt weak. Fortunately, it wasn't too serious and he wouldn't collapse directly. Lian Xian glanced at the horizon and shook her head. It's not enough. Yi Xian looked at Lian Xian. Still not enough? Lian Xian nodded. First, your sword is a little slow. Second, you only displayed the might of the 6 paths of truth and your boundless sword in that strike. You haven't displayed the might of your sword domain. Yi Xian said in a low voice, I know, but this sword domain can only be around 3 meters away from me. Lian Xian suddenly said, you're wrong. You're using your sword to form a domain, not your body. So, when the boundless sword arrives in front of your opponent, your sword can form a domain at the opponent's position. Yi Xian was slightly taken aback and then he said, is that possible? Lian Xian said, why don't you try? Yi Xian nodded. He took out the spring of life and began to absorb it. About half an hour later, Yi Xian stood up and looked at the distant horizon. After a moment of silence, a blood-red prisoner character suddenly appeared in the pitch-black horizon. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly opened his palm, and the executing heaven sword turned into a sword light and slashed out. The sword light tore through the horizon and arrived below the blood-red prisoner character. Boom. The blood-red prisoner character suddenly burst into flames, and in the blink of an eye, the pitch-black space was like a piece of burning paper, turning into ashes that could be seen with the naked eye. If the first time was just the destruction of space, then this time, it was the destruction of matter. And after Yi Xian displayed this sword, his whole body suddenly went limp and he almost collapsed. The consumption was too great. Lian Xian was silent and she fell into deep thought. After a moment, Yi Xian looked at Lian Xian. Miss Lian Xian, how is it? Lian Xian said in a low voice, it's very powerful. But, Speaking up to this point, she looked at Yi Xian. Don't use your bloodline. Yi Xian was puzzled. Why not? Lian Qian looked at Yi Xian. If you use your bloodline power, that space will completely disappear, and it will become something like a black hole. No, black holes have matter, and if you use your bloodline power, the power will cause irreversible consequences to the place you're targeting. Even your space Tao law will not be able to repair it, and it will truly be erased from this fourth dimension. Moreover, if you use your bloodline power, your body will not be able to bear it. Not only your body but Xiao Ta will also not be able to bear it. After all, he has not fully recovered yet. Yi Xian nodded. I understand. In fact, after displaying that sword, he also understood that if he used his bloodline power, the power of that sword would increase by at least a few times, and he would not be able to bear that kind of power. It must be known that he was displaying several trump cards at the same time, and it would naturally cause a great consumption of his body. Lian Qian said again, what you need to do now is to familiarize yourself with it, especially your sword domain. Your current sword domain is only a foundation of sword intent, and it is not perfect yet. What you need to do now is to slowly perfect it. Yi Xian said in a low voice, Miss Lian Qian, didn't you say that you would help me turn this sword domain into a new kind of sword domain? Lian Qian looked at Yi Xian. You only have 1.5 months, and what you need to do now is to survive after that, understand? Yi Xian nodded. I understand. Lian Qian nodded slightly. Practice then. Yi Xian nodded and then began to practice the sword domain. In the following time, Yi Xian practiced hard every day, and after practicing again and again, the speed at which he displayed the 6 paths of truth and the limitless sword became faster. Moreover, the power of the limitless sword and the 6 paths of truth were also stronger than before. In fact, he still had a trump card. That was the soul-suppressing sword. After the soul-suppressing sword absorbed the soul of the sword sect powerhouse, its level was no lower than the executing heaven sword. The soul-suppressing sword had already transformed. In fact, he was also a little curious because the soul-suppressing sword was not the same as before. It was still the sword spirit soul, but the feeling it gave him was different. In fact, he still had an ultimate trump card, but he did not want to use it. He knew that if he used this trump card it could solve many problems, but he did not want to use it. He did not want to use that method to solve problems every time he encountered them. Although he would solve it once and for all, he was afraid that he would become infatuated with that method. What people were most afraid of was dependence and laziness. Moreover, he also had a small thought. He hoped that when they met again he would return it to her untouched. Just like that, after about 10 days, Yi Xian became more and more proficient. As for Emperor Shi, he continued to study his space Tao law in seclusion. Yi Xian knew that Emperor Shi wanted to use the space Tao law to understand the space of the 5-dimensional universe. It could be said that the space Tao law was undoubtedly a new discovery for Emperor Shi. As for Yi Xian, during this time he was crazily studying his sword domain, the 6 paths of truth, and the limitless sword. As for the power of the bloodline, he did not dare to study it. Once he activated it, he would go crazy. What was the point of studying it? About 3 days later, Yi Xian, who was studying the sword domain, suddenly stopped. He took out the sound transmission stone, and soon, Wuxia's voice suddenly sounded from the sound transmission stone. Something has happened in the black-yellow great world. The swordsman has appeared in the north. Return quickly. Black-yellow great world. Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression instantly changed. The next moment, his eyes turned blood-red. P.S. The weather is getting colder. Everyone please keep warm. It will explode tomorrow. Chapter 831. The Black-Yellow Great World. Yi Xian did not expect that Jianmu would go to the Black-Yellow Great World. Obviously, he wanted to use his friends in the Black-Yellow Great World to threaten him. Yi Xian turned and left. At this moment, Emperor Shi suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. He looked at Yi Xian and said, "Little friend, don't go." Yi Xian did not speak. Emperor Shi said softly, "He is forcing you to show yourself. Besides, I don't think things are so simple." Yi Xian was silent for a moment, then said, "My sister, my friends, and the people I love are there." After saying this, he turned into a sword light and soared into the sky. As soon as he left the bamboo house, a monstrous pressure suddenly enveloped him. Yi Xian narrowed his eyes and was about to attack when Emperor Shi suddenly appeared in front of him. He looked at the sky and said softly, "It's the old bamboo staff." As he said this, he frowned slightly. "Old bamboo staff, are you going to get involved in this?" In the distant sky, a voice came, "I owe Jianmu a favor." Emperor Shi smiled and said, "I see." However, the price of this favor is very high. As he said this, he turned to look at Yi Xian and said, I will stop him. Yi Xian nodded. Thank you. After saying this, he turned into a sword light and disappeared into the horizon. At this moment, Emperor Shi suddenly pointed a finger, and a white light suddenly flew into Yi Xian's body. It was the Space Dao Law. After Yi Xian disappeared, Emperor Shi looked in the direction of the old bamboo staff. It seems that Jinmu is determined to kill him this time. In the distance, the old bamboo staff said, If you were the leader of the sword sect, would you let him live? Emperor Shi smiled and said, Don't you think that the sword sect has become too arrogant these years? The old bamboo staff said, They have become too powerful, haven't they? Emperor Shi nodded. Indeed. Could be said that the sword sect was indeed the #1 sect in the world. Even the combined forces of the dual realm capital couldn't contend against the experts of the sword sect. This sect had existed since the beginning of time, and its foundation was so deep that no one knew. After a while, Emperor Shi shook his head. I won't say much. Since you are here to stop me, then let's fight. Let me see what level you've reached, old bamboo staff man. Ah. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned into a beam of white light and soared into the sky. In next to no time, a shapeless pressure smashed down from the distant horizon. Not long after, this space began to tremble violently. At this moment, Yi Xian raised his speed to the extreme. Hurry back to the northern region. On the way, Yi Xian's face was terrifyingly gloomy. In the dual realm sky, a woman quietly watched the sword light streak across the sky in the distance. This person was Yuan Xiaodao. She already knew that Jinmu had gone to the Shenhuang Great World. In fact, she had already expected this possibility. It was impossible for the sword sect to give Yi Xian time to develop. The only way to force Yi Xian to show up and not run away was to go to the northern region and use Yi Xian's friends and sister to threaten him. This was the only way for Yi Xian to choose to face the sword sect head-on. Now the sword sect clearly wanted to force Yi Xian to fight. The sword sect no longer wanted to give Yi Xian any chance. They wanted to force Yi Xian to fight. She also knew that the people behind Yi Xian were not simple. However, the sword sect was the #1 sect in the four-dimensional universe. How could they be simple? Moreover, the sword sect's foundation was unimaginably deep. Apart from that, he faintly felt that this time, it was not just the sword sect. After a while, Yuan Xiaodao turned and left. No matter what, things had developed to an uncontrollable situation. Black-Yellow Great World, Northern Region. On this day, a swordsman arrived in the sky above the northern region. The person who came was Jinmu. Jinmu looked down at the northern region with an expressionless face. At this point, he had no other choice. He did not want to waste any more time with Yi Xian. He could not afford to do so. As soon as Jinmu appeared, a woman appeared in front of him. It was Qiao Tian'er, and beside her was Guan Jun. At this moment, their expressions were unprecedentedly serious. As soon as Jinmu appeared, they knew that the person in front of them was not someone they could defeat. Jinmu ignored them and looked down. Yi Ling and Lanxiu Emoxia Shaoqi Jiangjiu Shengguanxiano. Then he suddenly shook his head. Anyone related to Yi Xian, come out immediately. I won't repeat myself. At this moment, a sword light soared into the sky from below. A trace of surprise flashed in Jinmu's eyes. He put his finger together and pointed. Boom. The wisp of sword light exploded and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, a little girl appeared not far from Jinmu. Was Shaoqi. Besides Shaoqi, there was Lanxiu Emoxia and Lian Wanli. It could be said that the people present were the best in the northern region. Jinmu glanced at Lanxiu and the others. I didn't expect you to be so monstrous. He had to admit that he was a little surprised at this moment because the young people in front of him had extremely strong auras. Even in the sword sect, they were the best. There were so many monstrous geniuses in the small northern region. Shaoqi suddenly said, Your Excellency, you must have come for Yi Xian, right? Jinmu looked at Shaoqi. Yes. Shaoqi was expressionless. You can't do anything to him, so you came to target his friends and sister? Jinmu stared at Shaoqi. Yes. Shaoqi chuckled. You're a swordsman? Don't you think it's embarrassing? Where's the pride of the strong? Jinmu chuckled. The pride of the strong? Little girl, are you kidding me? My sword sect won't rest until Yi Xian is dead. You want me to talk to him about the pride of the strong? Mercy and pride are not to be used against enemies. Do you understand? Shaoqi nodded. I understand. As her voice faded, she suddenly drew her sword. The sword was fast. Like a bolt of lightning, it instantly arrived in front of Jinmu. Jinmu raised his hand and pointed. Xiao Qi's sword light was instantly cut apart. At this moment, Xiao Qi suddenly appeared in front of Jinmu and stabbed her sword at his throat. Whether it was speed or timing, this sword strike was well grasped. Unfortunately, she was facing Jinmu, the top swordsman in the four-dimensional universe. Before the sword reached Jinmu's forehead, Xiao Qi was sent flying. The moment Xiao Qi was sent flying, a spear suddenly pierced through Jinmu's head like a bolt of lightning. After the spear was in Lanxiu, Jinmu didn't even lift his hand. He opened his palm and a sword soared into the sky. Bang! The spear shook violently, and Lanxiu, who was behind the spear, was instantly sent flying. But at the instant she was sent flying, she suddenly punched downwards. Rumble. This punch instantly caused the space around Jinmu to explode. Jinmu retreated several steps, but in the next moment, a strand of sword light instantly arrived in front of Lanxiu's forehead. Lanxiu's pupils abruptly constricted. Her body forcefully flashed and she avoided the sword by a hair's breadth. But in the next moment, another sword came flying towards her. Lanxiu's body turned qi. A bloody arm was sent flying. Lanxiu's arm. But this wasn't the end. The formidable force directly blasted Lanxiu to the city wall below. She had just slammed into the city wall when 3 sword lights nailed her left arm and both her legs. At this moment, Xiao Qi was about to attack. However, Jinmu's speed was even faster than her. A strand of sword light slashed towards her. Xiao Qi drew her sword and slashed, seeking defeat. A strand of sword light formed a crescent moon as it vibrated out. Bang! With a swing of her sword, Xiao Qi instantly retreated explosively, and she hadn't retreated more than 10 m when another strand of sword light slashed over. Xiao Qi's pupils constricted slightly. She held her sword with both hands as she suddenly slashed forward. Break the world. This. A strand of snow-white sword light shot out explosively from the tip of her sword. Bang! This strand of snow-white sword light was instantly blasted apart. Xiao Qi retreated explosively once more, and at the instant that her sword light was blasted apart, another strand of sword light tore through the sky and slashed over. This time, Xiao Qi could only defend passively, and she raised her sword horizontally to block it. Bang! Along with an explosion, Xiao Qi was smashed down from midair and smashed heavily onto the city wall. Moreover, she didn't even have the time to react before 4 strands of sword light nailed her limbs. At the same time, a strand of formidable sword intent enveloped her, causing her to be unable to move at all. Qiao Tian'er and Guan Jun's faces sank when they witnessed this scene. This person's strength was too invincible. He wasn't someone they could go against at all. Realm strength and combat strength were suppressed. On the other hand, Wuxia glanced at Jinmu. In the next moment, a formidable aura swept out from within him, and then the image of an old man appeared behind him. Jinmu glanced at the image with an expressionless face. Ancestor's soul. Even if your ancestor were still alive, he wouldn't be qualified to fight the old man. As his voice faded, he suddenly slashed out with his sword. With this slash, a strand of sword light slashed at the illusory image behind Wuxia at a speed that couldn't be seen by the naked eye. After a moment of silence, the illusory image directly exploded. However, at this moment, Wuxia suddenly appeared in front of the sword wood. He suddenly clasped his hands together and then shook them forward. A powerful force vibrated out from his palms. Unfortunately, this force had just appeared when a sword slashed towards it. Wuxia's palms were slashed off. At the same time, his figure instantly appeared on the city wall, and then he was stared fixedly at by 4 swords. A complete defeat. No one was a match for Jinmu because the gap between them was too huge. With Jinmu's strength, it could be said that besides a few people, there was basically no one in the 4-dimensional universe who could kill him. Jinmu glanced at the surroundings and then he looked down. Yiling. According to the information he'd obtained, Yi Xian cared about Yiling the most. For Yiling, he was a person who could even throw away his life. As soon as Jinmu's voice fell, a little girl walked out from below. It was Yiling. At this moment, Qiao Tian'er appeared in front of Yiling. She was about to speak, but Yiling said softly, "Sister Qiao." Qiao Tian'er said softly, "Are you afraid?" Yiling shook her head. As she spoke, she slowly clenched her fists. Qiao Tian'er said in a deep voice, "Don't do anything stupid." Yiling smiled slightly. "I won't." As she spoke, she looked at Jinmu in the air. "Come, swordsman, use me to threaten my brother." These words struck the heart. Killing intent instantly surged explosively in Jinmu's eyes. Don't even dream of destroying my sword Dao. As soon as he finished speaking, a ray of sword light shot down explosively from the sky and slashed directly at Yi Ling. Chapter 832. His words struck at the heart. Yi Ling's words were undoubtedly striking at the heart. What did a swordsman fear the most? It was the wavering of his sword heart. Since swordsman Mu had been able to cultivate until now, there was no doubt that his sword heart was stable. However, the swordsman also feared one thing the most, and that was going against his heart. Going against his heart meant that his sword heart would waver. Being an enemy of Yi Xian, logically speaking, he should have gone to look for Yi Xian instead of looking for his sister. This kind of behavior went against his heart, and it was something he used to disdain. However, he had no other choice. If he did not do this, how could he force Yi Xian out? If Yi Xian continued to develop like this, he would become a great threat to the sword sect in the future. Moreover, the sword sect must obtain this treasure of the fifth dimension. This was the hope of the sword sect. But at this moment, Yi Ling's words had ignited the shame in his heart. Using a little girl to threaten others. This kind of behavior was also something he used to be very shameless. It should be known that he, Swordsman Mu, was once a genius with his own pride. However, at this moment he actually did this kind of thing. No matter what the reason was, no matter what the starting point was, this kind of behavior was very shameful, and it was not something an expert should do. Therefore, when Yi Ling's words came out, he knew that his sword heart had wavered. Thus, he directly had the intention to kill. If it was any other expert, they could change their heart at will, but this was not the case for a swordsman. Let alone Swordsman Mu, even if Yi Xian was thick-skinned, he would not do something that went against his heart and principles. A swordsman cultivated his heart. The stronger the heart, the stronger the sword. At this moment, Yi Ling's words directly caused his sword heart to waver. In the sky, a sword light shot down from the sky, heading straight for Yi Ling. Yi Ling looked at the incoming sword light with a calm expression. She did not resist, nor did she attack. She knew very well that she was no match for the old swordsman in front of her. Yi Ling slowly closed his eyes, scenes of the past appearing in his mind. The corner of Yi Ling's mouth lifted slightly. "Brother, I can't be your burden anymore." As soon as she finished speaking, the sword pierced the top of her head. Boom. A burst of invisible sword intent abruptly erupted from Yi Ling's body. Everyone in the northern region was dumbstruck when they saw this. It's over. This was what everyone was thinking. No. Right at this moment, a furious roar that sounded like the roar of a wild beast suddenly came from the distant horizon. It was Yi Xian's voice. Everyone looked at the horizon, and at this moment, a sword light had already landed in front of Yi Ling. Yi Xian looked at Yi Ling in front of him. At this moment, Yi Ling's body was gradually becoming illusory, and the color in her eyes was also gradually fading. However, when she saw Yi Xian, she slowly raised her trembling right hand, wanting to touch Yi Xian, but she could not lift it no matter how hard she tried. At this moment, Yi Xian grabbed Yi Ling's hand. His face was already covered in tears. And these tears were blood red. At this moment, the blood in his body began to tremble. Yi Ling grabbed Yi Xian's hand tightly and said with a trembling voice, "Brother, don't blame yourself." As soon as she finished speaking, she completely closed her eyes. Her body was still changing between illusory and real, but her aura had completely disappeared. No. Yi Xian suddenly hugged Yi Ling and he raised his head and roared, "No!" Boom. A blood-red light suddenly shot up from Yi Xian's body, and in an instant, the entire sky above the northern region was turned into a sea of blood. In the battlefield, everyone looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian hugged Yi Ling, and his entire body could not stop trembling as if he was extremely terrified. At the same time, a faint red light had already appeared around his body. In the sky, Jinmu stared fixedly at Yi Xian, and a strand of sword light silently condensed in his palm. After a moment of silence, Jinmu suddenly pointed at Yi Xian from afar. Break. As soon as he spoke, a strand of sword light directly pierced through space and instantly arrived above Yi Xian's head. Not only was this attack unexpected, but it was also extremely powerful. Jinmu did not hold back at all in this attack. He wanted to kill Yi Xian in one blow. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly turned around. Bang! In an instant, Yi Xian's entire body was covered in blood. Bloodline activation. Yi Xian suddenly stomped his right foot on the ground. Bang! A strand of blood-red light shot into the sky and directly smashed against the strand of sword light. Bang! The strand of sword light was directly forced to stop by this strand of blood-red light. Jinmu's expression instantly changed when he witnessed this scene. What bloodline is that? At this moment he was undoubtedly extremely shocked in his heart because he'd never seen such a formidable bloodline. A monster. The killing intent in Jinmu's eyes grew even stronger. The extent of how monstrous Yi Xian was had exceeded his expectations. If such a person were to continue growing, then he wouldn't even be able to sleep well. Yi Xian stared fixedly at Jinmu from below, and his eyes seemed like a sea of blood that was extremely horrifying. At this moment, his reason was already slowly vanishing. In midair, Jinmu suddenly pressed down lightly with his right hand, and the strand of sword light below him trembled violently. In the next moment, this strand of sword light directly slashed Yi Xian's blood-red light into pieces, and then it tore through the sky and slashed directly at Yi Xian. Yi Xian suddenly roared furiously, and the executing heaven sword in his hand transformed into a blood-red strand of sword light that shot into the sky. Bang! This strand of sword light directly slashed Jinmu's strand of sword light into pieces. In the next moment, Jinmu suddenly stomped his right foot on the ground, and his entire body transformed into a blood-red strand of sword light that shot explosively into the sky. Everywhere the blood-red light passed, space was directly obliterated. The might of bloodline energy coupled with the executing heaven sword was too formidable. In midair, Jinmu's eyes narrowed slightly. Let me see if you, Yi Xian, can surmount so many realms to challenge the old man. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly slashed down fiercely with his sword. Head-on. He naturally wouldn't shrink back when facing Yi Xian. After all, his cultivation was a few realms higher than Yi Xian. In terms of strength, he had absolute confidence in himself. In the sky, the two strands of sword light slashed together in the most direct way. Bang! A strand of sword light and chi sword suddenly exploded in the sky, and Yi Xian instantly retreated to the ground. As for Jinmu, he stood in midair and didn't retreat even half a step. In midair, Jinmu was about to speak, but suddenly his pupils shrank slightly. Your aura. How is this possible? At this moment, he was horrified to find that Yi Xian's aura was unexpectedly becoming stronger and stronger. Moreover, that speed was a little unreasonable. Below, Yi Xian's entire facial features began to distort, and his body seemed to be enduring some kind of great pain. Sister. At this moment, his mind was gradually losing its rationality, but there was only one word in his mind. Sister. However, this person was dead. Yi Xian suddenly slapped himself hard in the face. This slap made the left side of his face swollen. Not only that, but he also grabbed a strand of his hair and tore it off. Seeing this scene, Jinmu, who was in midair, frowned slightly. What the hell? He noticed that Yi Xian seemed to have lost its rationality. However, Yi Xian's aura had become even stronger, and it was still skyrocketing at a shocking speed. The more he lost his rationality, the stronger he became. Jinmu didn't think too much about it and was about to attack again. However, just at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly raised its head and looked at him. In the next moment, Jinmu felt a strong sense of danger, and before he could react, Yi Xian suddenly roared furiously, "Imprison!" As soon as his voice resounded, bang! Above Jinmu's head, a blood-red prisoner character suddenly appeared. The moment this blood-red prisoner character appeared, Jinmu's complexion instantly changed. He had just drawn his sword when a mysterious force directly locked him in place. At this moment he was actually unable to move at all. Jinmu was horrified. His right heart roared furiously, and then a strand of formidable sword intent suddenly surged out from within him. In an instant, the blood-red character, imprison, had become illusory. However, right at this moment Yi Xian suddenly attacked. The boundless sword. Jinmu's pupils constricted at the instant this attack appeared. At this moment he was horrified because he noticed how formidable this attack was. It disregarded one's realm of cultivation. When this attack arrived in front of Jinmu, the formidable sword intent he emanated transformed into a shield that blocked in front of him. However, as soon as this attack arrived, a mysterious barrier enveloped him. The sword domain. A domain formed from the sword. Even though it wasn't perfect, this incomplete sword domain was sufficient to deal a lethal blow to him at this moment. The sword arrived. The executioner's sword pierced through Jinmu's sword intent, and then it pierced through Jinmu's chest. A strand of blood sprayed violently from Jinmu's chest. Everyone present was dumbfounded. Yi Xian killed Jinmu? At this moment, Jinmu felt slight disbelief as well. He was very clearly aware of how great the gap between him and Yi Xian was. The gap between their cultivations was absolutely not something that external forces could make up for. However, the facts were that Yi Xian's sword had stabbed him. Jinmu didn't think too much about it. He suddenly pressed down with his right hand, and then a strand of formidable sword intent enveloped him. Because his body had started to turn illusory after Yi Xian's executioner sword pierced through his chest. His body was on the verge of destruction, so he hurriedly utilized his sword intent to suppress his body with the hope of protecting it. However, even this strand of sword intent wasn't able to protect his body, and it was practically dissipating at a visible speed. In a short period of time, his body had vanished completely, and only his soul remained. Right at this moment, a sword suddenly appeared in Yi Xian's hand. The soul suppression sword. Jianmu was astounded when he saw this sword, and he practically didn't hesitate to turn around and transform into a ray of black light that vanished into the horizon at an extremely swift speed. Yi Xian stopped moving. He didn't pursue because it was impossible. If an expert like Jianmu didn't fight, then at least 3 to 5 experts in the same realm of cultivation as him would be able to kill him. Yi Xian was stunned for a moment, and then he suddenly turned around and walked over to Yi Ling. At this moment Yi Ling wasn't breathing at all. Yi Xian carried Yi Ling on his back, and then he tied her tightly to him with a ribbon before he walked towards the distance. His destination was the Sword Sect. Chapter 833. The Sword Sect. At this moment, only a single thought remained in Yi Xian's mind. Vengeance. Even though he'd lost all reason, the thought of vengeance was still deeply present in his mind. There was nothing else in his mind besides vengeance right now. At the moment his younger sister died, he didn't want to think about anything else. Nothing was worth thinking about anymore. Moreover, he didn't want to live any longer. Of course, he had to do something before he died. Vengeance. Right at this moment, a woman suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. It was Jiang Jiao. Jiang Jiao gazed at Yi Xian with a pleading gaze. Don't go. Yi Xian paused for a moment, and then he transformed into a ray of blood-red light that vanished into the horizon. Jiang Jiao closed her eyes slowly when she saw this. She knew that Yi Xian had no intention of returning. From the moment that Yi Ling died, he had already given up on living. A short moment later, 2 streams of tears flowed out from the corners of Jiang Jiao's eyes, and her voice trembled slightly. You don't just have a younger sister. Deathly silence filled the surroundings after Yi Xian left. Everyone was able to discern that the young man didn't intend to return. Yi Xian. This name might only exist in the legends of the heaven-earth world in the future. Right at this moment, Enlancio suddenly transformed into a ray of white light that shot into the sky in pursuit of Qinshi. Lian Wanli and Emocia were behind Enlancio. In midair, Qiao Tian'er fell silent for a short moment before she stood in front of Enlancio and the others. Enlancio gazed at Qiao Tian'er. Qiao Tian'er shook her head. Are the 3 of you going to help or give your lives away? I won't stop you if you're going to give your lives away, but it's best that you don't go if you're going to help. Lian Wanli asked. Why? Qiao Tian'er spoke softly. Didn't all of you see his strength? After he activated that bloodline, he directly destroyed that old man's body. That old man's strength is definitely at the peak of the 4th dimension. In other words, he might have a chance of winning if he goes to take revenge. The 3 of them fell silent. Qiao Tian'er continued, also, don't forget that he has people backing him. The 3 of you should go. Forgive me for being blunt, but compared to his crazy state, the 3 of you are too weak. If you go, not only will you not be able to help, you will also become a burden. At this moment, 7 walked over and said, Then what should we do? Are we just going to wait here? Qiao Tian'er said solemnly, Wait. This is the only thing we can do now. As she spoke, she looked at the 3 of them with a complicated expression. I know how you feel, but this is the best choice we have right now. We can only choose to believe him. Enlancio said softly, even if he wins, he won't choose to live. Everyone fell silent when they heard this. Everyone knew that Yi Xian and Yi Ling had depended on each other since they were young, and they had a deep sibling relationship. Now that Yi Ling had been killed, it was undoubtedly a fatal blow to Yi Xian. In Yi Xian's world, his younger sister was the most important. Qiao Tian'er sighed softly. Wait for a miracle. In the dual realm sky. News of what happened in the north quickly spread to the dual realm sky. The reason why it spread so quickly was because the people of the dual realm sky had been paying attention to Yi Xian. Above a certain cloud, Pavilion Elder Chen put away the scroll in his hand, and a smile appeared on his face. What a great Yi Xian. He actually cut Jianmu's body with a single strike. How unbelievable. As he spoke up to hear, a trace of fear flashed in his eyes. He knew very well that Jianmu's strength far surpassed his, but Yi Xian had actually cut Jianmu's body with a single strike. What did this mean? It meant that although Yi Xian's cultivation was only at the creation realm, his battle prowess had already reached the peak of the four-dimensional universe. And now he was only at the creation realm. If he reached the life-breaking or Dao-seeker realm, how terrifying would he be? It was unimaginable. Qin Shi, who was in front of Pavilion Elder Qin, said in a low voice, "Pavilion Elder, this Yi Xian clearly wants to fight to the death with the sword sect. Should we make a move?" Pavilion Elder Qin shook his head. "Why should we make a move? Isn't it better to let them fight until both sides suffer?" Qin Shi wanted to say something but hesitated. Pavilion Elder Qin glanced at Qin Shi. "You have to understand that the relationship between us and Yi Xian is only one of benefits. He is not one of us, and it is impossible for him to become one of us, because that supreme treasure might be on him. But now he is fighting to the death with the sword sect. No matter who wins, it will be good for us." Qin Shi nodded slightly. "I understand," Pavilion Elder Qin said in a low voice. "Let us see if this Yi Xian will go to the sword sect for revenge this time. Will he hit a rock with an egg, or will he directly overthrow the sword sect?" Qin Shi shook his head. "It will be difficult. Even the dual realm sky did not know the strength and foundation of the sword sect. It could only be described as unfathomable. After all, it was the most powerful sect in the four-dimensional universe. How could the number of powerful swordsmen hidden in the sect be small? And although Yi Xian had people behind him, could the people behind him really suppress the sword sect? Could they? They did not know because Yi Xian was not simple either. In short, this was a good thing for the dual realm sky. Whether Yi Xian won or the sword sect won, the dual realm sky would not suffer in the end. At the end of the horizon, a blood-red sword light streaked across the sky. Everywhere it passed, the sky turned blood-red. It was an extremely frightening sight. It was Yi Xian. And Yi Xian's direction was the sword world. He had never been to the sword world, but someone was pointing the way for him. Obviously, it was someone from the dual realm sky. Somewhere, Yuan Xiaodao looked at the blood-red sword light streaking across the sky in silence. She did not stop it because she knew she could not stop it. Moreover, the current Yi Xian was extremely dangerous. She did not have the ability to suppress Yi Xian. Not only could she not suppress him, but if she tried to stop him, her life would be in danger. After a while, Yuan Xiaodao sighed softly. The sword sect. As she spoke, she looked into the distant sky with a trace of doubt in her eyes. "Why hasn't the person behind you appeared?" In the sword world. At that moment, the sword world still did not know what had happened. Because Jianmu had returned secretly, only the sword sect leader, Mu Qingfeng, knew that he was only left with his soul. In a large hall, Mu Qingfeng looked at Jianmu's soul in front of him. His expression was unprecedentedly serious. Soul. Jianmu was only left with his soul. How was this possible? He knew his master's strength the best. In this four-dimensional universe, there were people who could kill his master, but there were definitely only a handful of them. Mu Qingfeng said in a low voice, "Master. Who did it?" Jianmu slowly closed his eyes. "Yi Xian. Yi Xian." Hearing this, Mu Qingfeng's pupils shrank. How is this possible? Jinmu's expression was complicated. In fact, even he himself wanted to ask how it was possible. Normally, Yi Xian would never be able to unleash such a powerful sword. Now that he thought about it, he knew that the real fatal blow to him was the blood-red prisoner character above his head and the other mysterious force. It was those two mysterious forces that suppressed him and made him unable to move. He could only take on Yi Xian's sword. Of course, the sword that Yi Xian had unleashed was too terrifying. Even now, he could not understand what kind of sword skill it was for it to be so powerful. As if he had thought of something, Jinmu's pupils shrank. Bloodline. He had almost forgotten about that. What was truly terrifying about Yi Xian was not the blood-red prisoner character, nor was it that mysterious force, nor was it that sword skill. It was his bloodline. After Yi Xian activated his bloodline, it was as if he had become a different person. The power of his bloodline was the main reason. At this time, Mu Qingfeng said in a low voice, "Master. Was it really Yi Xian who did it?" Jinmu nodded. "Yes." Mu Qingfeng frowned slightly. "Impossible. With his strength, it would be impossible for him to hurt you, Master," Jinmu said in a low voice. "It was him. We have greatly underestimated this person's strength." At this point, a complicated look flashed in his eyes. "This person's bloodline is so powerful. He is definitely not an ordinary person," Mu Qingfeng said. "In the past, it was rumored that our sword sect's founder also had a special bloodline. However, it seems that the founder had never used it." Jinmu nodded. It is true that the founder has a special bloodline. However, the sword sect has never recorded his bloodline. At this point he looked at Jinmu. Immediately issue an edict. Have all the sword sect's disciples in that place rush back. Mu Qingfeng frowned slightly. Just as he was about to speak, a swordsman suddenly appeared outside the hall. The swordsman bowed slightly. Sect Master, there is a swordsman rushing towards our sword world. Hearing this, Mu Qingfeng narrowed his eyes. Is it that Yi Xian? The swordsman nodded. Yes. Yi Xian. Mu Qingfeng looked at Jinmu. The latter's face was quite gloomy. He has guts. Mu Qingfeng said in a low voice, I will go meet him. Jinmu suddenly shook his head. There is someone behind this person. Tell our sword sect to be extremely careful. I need some time to reconstruct my body. Just delay him. Mu Qingfeng bowed slightly. Understood. With that he turned and left. Inside the hall, Jinmu was silent for a moment. His face gradually became ferocious. He destroyed my body. With that he turned and left. Reconstruct his body. What he needed to do now was to reconstruct his body and recover his strength. Without his body, his strength would be greatly reduced. And he had to do it quickly because the current Yi Xian was a little difficult to deal with. After Mu Qingfeng left the hall, he directly turned into a sword light and shot towards the sky. At the same time, he issued an edict for all the sword sect's disciples outside to return as soon as possible. Apart from that, he also issued a sword order. Be on guard. The sword sect be on guard. At this moment, the entire sword sect was shocked. The sword sect be on guard. This had not happened for tens of thousands of years. Soon, all the sword sect's disciples began to gather. At this moment, a man came to the boundary of the sword world. The man's entire body was blood red like a blood man. On his back there was a little girl without any signs of life. Chapter 834. Yi Xian. Yi Xian stood silently in front of the sword realm's barrier. His eyes were like a sea of blood, devoid of any color. He looked like a dried corpse that had lost its soul. Right at this moment, a flying sword suddenly flew out from within the barrier, and it slashed straight towards Yi Xian. It was as swift as a bolt of lightning. And the sword stopped when it was half an inch away from Yi Xian's forehead. Because Yi Xian's left hand had grabbed it. After a moment of silence, Yi Xian suddenly clenched his left hand, and the sword transformed into a ray of blood-red light that exploded and vanished without a trace. Yi Xian walked slowly to the sword realm's barrier, and then he swung the executing heaven sword. Bang! The barrier trembled violently and then it cracked. Yi Xian swung it again. Bang! The barrier cracked into the shape of a spider web. Yi Xian swung it again. Rumble! The entire barrier exploded with a loud bang, and in the instant that the barrier exploded, several sword lights slashed straight at him like lightning. Yi Xian blocked them with his sword, and a ray of blood-red light surged out from the executing heaven sword. Bang! The rays of light were shattered by the ray of blood-red light. Meanwhile, a middle-aged man appeared in front of Yi Xian. The middle-aged man gazed at Yi Xian. How dare you offend my sword sect, you? At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly disappeared. A ray of blood-red light flashed, and the swordsman's head flew into the air before he could even react. Blood sprayed out like a fountain, and the blood was instantly absorbed by Yi Xian. Yi Xian carried his sister on his back and continued forward. At this moment, no swordsman came to stop him. Because they'd noticed that an ordinary swordsman who tried to stop Yi Xian was undoubtedly courting death. Right at this moment, a sword howl resounded abruptly in the distance, and then a dense expanse of swords appeared in the sky. Sword array. Facing Yi Xian, the sword sect directly used the sword formation. Obviously they did not want to lose people. Mu Qingfeng was not stupid. If Yi Xian could destroy Yi Xian's physical body, how could an ordinary swordsman deal with him? So, he directly utilized the sword sect's sword formation. This sword formation wasn't something an ordinary person could deal with. Countless sword chi shot towards Yi Xian like torrential rain. Just the pressure alone was enough to make it hard for one to breathe. Yi Xian raised his head and looked at the sky full of sword chi. He didn't choose to attack and allowed the sword chi to slash his body. However, countless experts of the sword sect were stunned. Because those energy swords were directly absorbed by Yi Xian. Tens of thousands of energy swords were all absorbed. Seeing this, Mu Qingfeng's eyes were filled with disbelief. How is this possible? The spectators were filled with disbelief as well. He absorbed the energy swords. Right at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly opened his eyes, and then two blood-red rays of sword light shot out explosively from his eyes. The head of a sword sect expert that was over 10 kilometers away from him had been chopped off. Blood sprayed out like a fountain. Everyone in the surroundings was shocked. Yi Xian had actually instantly killed him? Yi Xian suddenly vanished on the spot. An expanse of blood-red light slashed through the sky, and everywhere it passed, space was obliterated inch by inch. At the same time, a monstrous vicious energy and killing intent swept madly towards the surroundings. At this moment, Yi Xian was like a god of death that had descended into the world. Mu Qingfeng stared fixedly at Yi Xian. At this moment he slightly believed Yi Xian's words. Yi Xian's current strength was truly terrifying. As Yi Xian got closer and closer, Mu Qingfeng suddenly said, "7 swords." As soon as he finished speaking, 7 rays of light suddenly flew out from behind Mu Qingfeng. In the next moment, the 7 rays of light crisscrossed and formed a sword formation that enveloped Yi Xian in the distance. 7 swords. This referred to the 7 elders of the sword sect. The weakest amongst them was at the life-destruction realm, and they'd always been studying sword formations. When the 7 of them joined forces, they were completely capable of easily killing a Dao Seeker realm expert. After witnessing Yi Xian's strength, Mu Qingfeng naturally wouldn't underestimate Yi Xian. So he'd sent the 7 elders of the sword sect. Moreover, he'd ordered them to use their sword formation. At the instant that the sword formation appeared, the space around Yi Xian was sliced apart. The space that was sliced apart was instantly obliterated and vanished forever. Everyone was staring at that space. Had Yi Xian been killed? At that moment Yi Xian walked out. Seeing this, all the experts of the sword sect were petrified. This was because the moment Yi Xian walked out, he'd absorbed the sword formation. He'd absorbed it. Mu Qingfeng stared at Yi Xian, his fists clenched. His heart was filled with shock. This could be absorbed? Sword formations could also be absorbed? How were they supposed to fight? The 7 swordsmen were also dumbfounded. The sword formation formed by the 7 of them had actually been absorbed by Yi Xian? At that moment Yi Xian suddenly vanished. The expressions of the 7 of them changed drastically. At the same time Mu Qingfeng's voice rang out. "Watch out." The 7 of them naturally didn't dare to be careless. At the instant that Yi Xian charged at them, the 7 of them suddenly threw the swords in their hands. The 7 swords transformed into 7 rays of light that slashed at Yi Xian from 7 different angles. However, Yi Xian didn't dodge or resist when faced with these 7 powerful swords. He allowed the 7 swords to slash at him. Then everyone was stunned once more. Because the 7 swords had been absorbed by Yi Xian again. The 7 swordsmen were completely dumbfounded when they saw this. Absorbed again? What's going on? The 7 of them looked at each other, disbelief written all over their faces. Mu Qingfeng stared at Yi Xian. At this moment he finally understood. Yi Xian could absorb these swords and sword energy. But the question was, why was Yi Xian able to absorb them? He couldn't figure it out. And if this went on, who in the sword sect could stop Yi Xian? At that moment Yi Xian suddenly vanished. This time Yi Xian's speed was extremely fast. The 7 swordsmen's expressions changed drastically. The swordsman in the lead drew his sword and slashed. A powerful sword energy shot out from his sword. However, in the face of this powerful sword energy, Yi Xian didn't even block it. He allowed the sword energy to slash at him. Just like before, the sword energy was directly absorbed. Seeing this, the swordsman's expression changed drastically. At this moment he knew he was finished. Just as he thought, a blood-red sword energy slashed at his throat, and his head flew off. However, the moment his head flew off, his soul left his body as if trying to escape. At this moment, a mysterious force suddenly enveloped him, and the next moment, his soul was directly devoured by a sword. Soul-suppressing sword. This time he completely disappeared from this world. After killing the swordsman, Yi Xian charged at the remaining 6 people. Seeing Yi Xian charge at them, the 6 people's expressions changed drastically. They didn't dare to draw their swords at all, because their swords were useless against Yi Xian. They couldn't fight him at all. At this moment, Mu Qingfeng suddenly said, "Retreat." Hearing Mu Qingfeng's words, the 6 people felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. They immediately turned and ran. They were extremely fast, and in the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the horizon. Mu Qingfeng said again, "Everyone retreat to World Peak. Without my order, no one is allowed to attack." Hearing Mu Qingfeng's words, the surrounding sword sect experts retreated one after another. Right now they didn't want to fight Yi Xian. How could they fight him? They couldn't fight him at all. After the swordsman left, Mu Qingfeng looked at Yi Xian. He slowly clenched his right hand, and in his palm, a sword energy quietly condensed. Yi Xian slowly walked toward Mu Qingfeng. The latter's expression was extremely solemn. If it were before, he wouldn't have been afraid of Yi Xian at all. But now he was extremely afraid. Because Yi Xian had even destroyed his master's physical body. His strength was naturally not as strong as Jian Mu. In other words, it was possible that Yi Xian could kill him. Of course he still didn't believe it. He didn't believe that Yi Xian could be that strong. He wanted to try. The reason he chose to try was because he had no other choice. Right now, someone had to hold off Yi Xian until Jian Mu's physical body recovered. The average swordsman was no match for Yi Xian at all. Aside from him, anyone else who fought against Yi Xian would be sending themselves to their deaths. Only he could stop Yi Xian. In the distance, Yi Xian didn't waste any time. He turned into a beam of blood-red light and disappeared. Mu Qingfeng's eyes narrowed. The next moment he suddenly opened his palm and a small sword flew out. The sword passed without leaving a trace and it was extremely fast. At that moment Yi Xian, who was not far away, suddenly stopped. This time he didn't choose to use his body to block the attack. Instead, he slashed down with the executing heaven sword in his hand. Boom! A blood-red light suddenly erupted, and Yi Xian instantly retreated several thousand feet away. As soon as he stopped, streaks of sword qi engulfed him from all directions. This time Yi Xian also didn't use his body to block the attack. He swung the executing heaven sword and blood-red beams of light shot out. Pust 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 pust. In the entire sky, a series of densely packed slicing sounds rang out continuously. It was extremely frightening. At first, Yi Xian's blood-red beams of light were barely able to resist, but gradually Yi Xian was at a disadvantage. He kept retreating. Not only that, but some of the sword energy even pierced through his body. However, it wasn't fatal. Just like that, after about 15 minutes, Yi Xian was dragged out of the sword realm. Seeing this, Mu Qingfeng's lips curled into a cold smile. Looks like you can't absorb everything. As soon as he said that, Yi Xian, who was far away, suddenly stopped. The next moment, the sky above his head darkened. At the same time, a blood-red prisoner character appeared above his head. The moment the blood-red prisoner character appeared, Mu Qingfeng's expression changed. He was just about to resist when another mysterious power enveloped him. Sword Realm. The moment the power of the Sword Realm appeared, a sword was already in front of him. An infinite sword. It ignored realms and everything else. At that moment, Mu Qingfeng could only choose to block it. He had no other choice. At this moment of life and death, Mu Qingfeng suddenly roared, and countless sword auras surged out of his body. However, as soon as the sword auras appeared, they were suppressed by the Sword Realm and the Six Paths of Truth. At this time Yi Xian's sword flew through his throat. Mu Qingfeng's head was sent flying. Yi Xian appeared behind Mu Qingfeng. He stabbed with his sword. This sword pierced through Mu Qingfeng's head. Mu Qingfeng's eyes were wide open. His soul couldn't even escape, because this sword was the soul-suppressing sword. Yi Xian's sword pierced through Mu Qingfeng's head. He looked into the distance. After a moment of silence, he suddenly roared, "Arg!" Boom! In the blink of an eye, the sky had turned into a sea of blood. Chapter 835. Mu Qingfeng had been killed. At this moment, the entire sword sect was shocked. Mu Qingfeng had actually been killed by Yi Xian. The disciples of the sword sect were finally starting to panic. After all, Mu Qingfeng was the sect leader of the sword sect, and his strength was considered to be at the top in the fourth dimension. However, he'd been killed by Yi Xian. Moreover, even his soul hadn't managed to escape. Why is Yi Xian so strong? Countless experts of the sword sect gasped in shock. The eyes of Mu Qingfeng's head, the Yi Xian's executing heaven sword, were wide open, and they were filled with disbelief. Even at the moment of his death, he'd never imagined that Yi Xian would be able to instantly kill him with a single strike. It was an instant kill. In that instant he came to an understanding. Yi Xian had been showing weakness earlier. But hadn't Yi Xian gone mad? There was no answer. Mu Qingfeng had died rather aggrieved, or perhaps it could be said that he was extremely unwilling. He didn't dare believe that he'd died just like that. Even his soul hadn't been preserved. In the battlefield, after Yi Xian killed Mu Qingfeng, he transformed into a beam of sword light and shot into the distance. Wherever the blood-red light passed, the space turned into nothingness. At this moment, the killing intent and hostility he emanated was growing stronger and stronger, and it had reached an indescribable state. At this moment he truly seemed like a demon from the depths of hell. Countless experts of the sword sect were shocked when they saw Yi Xian charge at them. Yi Xian was like the bane of the swordsmen. How could they possibly fight him? Meanwhile, a voice resounded from within the sword hall. Stop him. 2 hours. 2 hours. It was Jinmu's voice. As soon as Jinmu's voice resounded, the ground in front of the sword hall suddenly split open, and then a ray of light shot into the sky. It forced Yi Xian to stop on the spot. The light dispersed, and then an old man appeared in front of Yi Xian. It's Grand Elder Emoli. Someone cried out in surprise. Emoli. The great elder of the sword sect was also a core member of the sword sect. He was currently at the peak of the life-breaking realm. He had been obsessed with swordsmanship all his life and basically didn't care about the internal affairs of the sword sect. In the sword sect, some of the core members rarely saw him. And this time, when the sword sect was in danger, he came out. Looking at Yi Xian in front of her, Emoli also looked extremely solemn. Mu Qingfeng had been killed. His heart was also incomparably shocked. This was because he was very clear about Mu Qingfeng's strength. Even in the entire four-dimensional universe, Mu Qingfeng belonged to the top. But just now Mu Qingfeng had been killed by this young man. Even his soul did not escape. Emoli was also somewhat shocked in her heart. Yi Xian's strength was actually powerful to such a degree. At this moment Yi Xian suddenly disappeared. A dot of red light appeared in front of Emoli, boundless sword. Although he didn't use the 6 paths of truth or the sword domain, but Emoli's pupils suddenly constricted. He didn't dodge nor did he draw his sword. Instead he directly punched at Yi Xian's chest. Bang! A ray of sword light directly pierced through Emoli's forehead, and Yi Xian's entire body was sent flying. When he stopped, he spat out several mouthfuls of blood essence. Not only that, but his body also cracked like a spider web. This time, the old man didn't draw his sword because he knew that drawing his sword would be meaningless. Yi Xian's physique was special. His body couldn't be injured by a sword. Therefore he directly chose to use his fist. Of course the price was his life. Yi Xian was injured, but Emoli died directly. Even his soul couldn't escape. Emoli glanced at the surroundings while a trace of infatuation could be seen in his eyes. At this moment he suddenly felt slightly regretful. He didn't regret using his life to stop Yi Xian. He regretted not taking a good look at the world. He'd been pursuing the limits of the sword Dao his entire life, yet he'd never calmed down to take a good look at the world. Now that he was about to die, he suddenly realized that he seemed to have missed out on a huge amount. Right at this moment. Bang! A strand of monstrous sword intent suddenly shot into the sky from within Emoli. Breakthrough. A breakthrough in the sword Dao. This sword intent was so strong that it could obliterate the world. All the experts of the sword sect were overjoyed. However, it didn't take long for their expressions to dim down, because Emoli's eyes had lost all color. However, there was a faint smile on the corners of his mouth. At the moment before his death, he'd understood. The sword Dao wasn't supreme and it came from life. Unfortunately, he'd comprehended it too late. Emoli had perished. All the experts of the sword sect gazed at Yi Xian, and their eyes were filled with killing intent. Meanwhile, a voice suddenly resounded. He's heavily injured. Kill him. As soon as the voice resounded, a ray of light slashed straight at Yi Xian. However, the ray of light was instantly absorbed by Yi Xian. The expressions of all the swordsmen turned extremely unsightly when they witnessed this scene. How do we fight him? Meanwhile, another voice resounded. Don't use your sword. Don't use your sword. The others came to a sudden realization when they heard this voice. Yi Xian could absorb swords, but it was limited to swords. If he used his fists or sabers, then Yi Xian wouldn't be able to absorb them. When they thought up to this point, a few swordsmen charged at Yi Xian. They didn't use their swords. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly vanished. A ray of light flashed, and then a bloody head flew into the air. After that, another 2 bloody heads flew into the air. They were instantly killed. The remaining swordsmen hurriedly stopped when they witnessed this scene. They'd forgotten that their strength would be greatly reduced if they didn't use their swords. Under such circumstances, they weren't a match for Yi Xian at all. A slaughter. It didn't take long for Yi Xian to start a frenzied slaughter within the sword world. He killed everyone on sight. Yet now no one in the sword sect could stop Yi Xian at all. Even if they utilized some sword formations, all of them were absorbed by Yi Xian. Most importantly, after Yi Xian had killed people, he had absorbed their blood, energy, and souls directly. Then he had become even stronger. Moreover, Yi Xian's ability to recover was too terrifying. It didn't take long for numerous shrill cries to resound within the sword world. Presently no one could stop Yi Xian. It didn't take long for Yi Xian to kill his way to the sword sect's sword hall, and behind him was a pool of blood. Yi Xian was carrying Yi Ling on his back, and his eyes were bloodshot. Boundless killing intent and viciousness radiated from his body, and this viciousness was so strong that it could withstand the sword sect's sword intent. Meanwhile, a middle-aged swordsman appeared not far from Yi Xian. The middle-aged swordsman looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian, my sword sect and you? Yi Xian suddenly vanished. The middle-aged swordsman's head flew into the air, and his blood was instantly absorbed by Yi Xian. As for his soul, it was absorbed by Yi Xian's soul-quelling sword. He was directly wiped out and he couldn't even reincarnate. You've gone too far. At this time, an angry roar suddenly sounded from afar. Then a sword ray flew from afar and slashed at Yi Xian. Yi Xian didn't dodge and let the sword slash at him. Boom. The sword was directly absorbed by Yi Xian, and at this time the executing heaven sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly flew out. In the distance, the swordsman's pupils suddenly shrank. He stomped his right foot and slashed down with his sword. The executing heaven sword directly shattered his sword, and then, it pierced through the middle of his brows. At this time Yi Xian appeared behind him. Yi Xian stretched out his right hand and caught the executing heaven sword. Then he slashed backward. The swordsman's head flew into the air. Yi Xian tapped the tip of his foot lightly and charged forward. This time his target was the group of swordsmen in the distance. The swordsmen's expressions changed drastically when they saw Yi Xian charging at them. At this time an old man suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. The old man didn't draw his sword but instead he punched forward. Boom. The space in front of Yi Xian collapsed and Yi Xian stopped. The old man stared at Yi Xian who had stopped in the distance. He slowly clenched his right hand and a powerful force gathered in his palm. After a moment of silence, he suddenly took a step forward and punched with his right hand. Boom. A powerful force swept out from his fist, and the space in its path began to be annihilated inch by inch. Fist out. In the distance, Yi Xian held the executing heaven sword with both hands, and a blood-red glow surged into his executing heaven sword. A moment later he suddenly slashed forward. Boom. The old man's force was directly shattered by Yi Xian's sword. Meanwhile, Yi Xian appeared in front of the old man, and the old man revealed a ferocious expression. Bring it on. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly clapped his hands together. Boom. The space where he stood exploded and turned pitch black. All the swordsmen were looking at that spot and a moment later, a man walked out. It was Yi Xian, and there was a bloody head stuck in the executing heaven sword in his right hand. It was the old man's head. However, the corners of Yi Xian's mouth were bleeding incessantly, and he looked much better than before. However, there was a dark green gas coiling around his body. The fountain of life. He'd been absorbing the fountain of life since the beginning, and that was why he'd been able to maintain his formidable combat strength. Even though he'd lost his mind, attacking and recovering were all instincts, and they were actions that were deeply rooted in his bones. Yi Xian walked slowly towards the sword sect's experts in the distance. The old man's head was still bleeding incessantly on his executing heaven sword. The swordsmen retreated incessantly when they saw this. It wasn't that they didn't dare to fight, it was that they didn't know how to fight Yi Xian. How could they fight? Yi Xian could absorb swords. However, they had to delay him for a while longer. As long as Jinmu didn't come out, the sword sect's experts couldn't do anything to Yi Xian. It wasn't that they weren't strong. After all, the sword sect had no less than 20 Fate Realm experts. However, their swords couldn't pose any threat to Yi Xian. Yi Xian's constitution was the natural counter to the swordsman. Stop him. Suddenly Jinmu's voice resounded from within the hall once more. Some of them had unsightly expressions on their faces. Stop him? Oh. They didn't dare to attack Yi Xian at all. Suddenly Jinmu's voice resounded once more. Get out of that box. The box. One of the black-clothed old men hesitated for a moment before he said, That's one of the sword sect's trump cards. Get out. Jinmu's voice resounded once more. The old man thought for a moment before he nodded, and then he formed a seal. It didn't take long for the ground in front of Yi Xian to split open, and then a pitch-black box floated out from within it. The black-clothed old man's eyes were filled with bewilderment as he gazed at the box. It was one of the 3 trump cards left behind by the sword sect's founding ancestor all those years ago. It was said that the sword sect could activate it if it encountered any danger. It could resolve any danger the sword sect faced. The sword sect hadn't utilized it throughout the years, but it had no choice now. What exactly would be inside it? The old man didn't think too much about it. He just pointed with his finger and the black box opened up. A ray of white light floated out from within the box, but there was no movement. Everyone gazed at the box and held their breaths. A short while later, a white and fluffy little fellow crawled out slowly from within it. P.S. Brothers, keep warm. Chapter 836. The White Little Fellow? Everyone in the surroundings was stunned. The trump card left behind by the sword sect's founding ancestor is a little fellow? As soon as the little fellow emerged, she rubbed her drowsy eyes and stretched herself. Meanwhile, she suddenly opened her eyes and gazed at Yi Xian, and her eyes instantly opened wide when she saw Yi Xian. Her entire body shuddered, and then she turned around and ran. Everyone here was stunned when they witnessed this scene. She ran? Just like that? The experts of the sword sect felt like their brains had short-circuited. At this moment, the little white thing suddenly stopped. She turned around to look at Yi Xian, who was not far away. She blinked. She suddenly recalled why she should be afraid. It wasn't him. The white little fellow floated over to Yi Xian. The black-clothed old man hesitated for a moment before he said, "Your Highness, he trespassed into our sword sect and killed members of our sword sect." The white little fellow suddenly stretched out a claw at the black-clothed old man, and she signaled him to keep quiet. The black-clothed old man was at a loss for words. The white little fellow glanced at Yi Xian, and then Yi Xian suddenly drew his sword and slashed. At this moment he actually didn't recognize anyone. No, apart from Yi Ling who was on his back, he really didn't recognize anyone else. As for Yi Ling, he couldn't say that he recognized Yi Ling as well. It could only be said that Yi Ling was his final strand of obsession. The white little fellow blinked when she saw Yi Xian attack, and then she waved her claw. A white sword appeared in her grasp, and then she raised it horizontally to block Yi Xian's attack. Bang! This sword, she actually blocked it directly. The members of the sword sect were overjoyed when they witnessed this scene. She blocked it. At first, they thought that this cute little guy came out to act cute, but now it seemed that he had the strength. After the little white fellow blocked Yi Xian with her sword, she did not counterattack. Instead, she gently waved her left claw, and a white aura enveloped Yi Xian. Under the cover of this white aura, the hostility and killing intent on Yi Xian's body gradually disappeared. All the experts of the sword sect were stunned once more when they witnessed this scene. What was he doing? Gradually, the redness in Yi Xian's eyes faded, and he regained some clarity. The instant Yi Xian regained some consciousness, he was stunned for a moment. But soon he seemed to have thought of something and he suddenly put Yi Ling down from his back. When he saw that Yi Ling was no longer breathing, his face instantly twisted, and he turned to look at the experts from the sword sect. Boom! A bloody light swept out from his body. Just as he regained a sliver of clarity, he instantly reverted back to normal. The energy of his bloodline erupted madly once more. The white little fellow blinked when she witnessed this scene, and then she hurriedly waved her claw again. In next to no time, Yi Xian was enveloped by countless strands of white light, and the hostility and killing intent Yi Xian emanated were suppressed once more. When a trace of clarity returned to Yi Xian's eyes, the white little fellow hurriedly flew over to Yi Ling, pointed at Yi Ling and then pointed at herself. Yi Xian was stunned by this scene, and then he said hoarsely, What are you trying to say?" The little fellow gazed at Yi Ling, and it didn't take long for a wisp of surprise to flash through her eyes. After that, she placed her claw lightly on Yi Ling's head, and then countless strands of dark violet energy surged out from her claw. It didn't take long for Yi Ling to be enveloped by the violet energy. Yi Xian gazed at Yi Ling while his body trembled slightly. A short while passed, but there was still no movement from Yi Ling. The white little fellow's brows knit together slightly, and there was a trace of bewilderment in her large eyes. Right at this moment, Yi Xian's eyes suddenly became deathly still. "Impossible." As he spoke, he gazed at the white little fellow. "Bury me with my younger sister later." As soon as he finished speaking, bang! Yi Xian was instantly covered in blood, and then he transformed into a ray of blood-red light that charged towards the experts of the sword sect. The white little fellow stomped her claws anxiously when she saw Yi Xian become covered in blood again. She wanted to chase after Yi Xian, but she seemed to have thought of something and lowered her head to look at Yi Ling instead. She knew that she had to save this woman, otherwise even if Yi Xian recovered, he would immediately become covered in blood. But why can't I save her? The white little fellow's eyes were filled with bewilderment. A short while later, she seemed to have noticed something and her eyes lit up. She placed her right claw on Yi Ling's abdomen and pressed down lightly. With this, Yi Ling's body instantly became illusory, and then a mysterious aura suddenly seeped out from her body. The little fellow sniffed lightly and soon she became slightly excited. Then she pressed down lightly with her little claw again. At this moment Yi Ling's brows were slightly knitted together. The little fellow noticed this and she hurriedly mobilized a large amount of purple qi, which was madly absorbed by Yi Ling. Seeing this, a bright smile appeared on the little fellow's chubby little face, and then she started transferring the purple qi again. In the distance Yi Xian had already gone berserk. At this moment no one could stop Yi Xian, especially the swordsmen before him. These swordsmen were completely helpless against Yi Xian, and they could only wait to be slaughtered. To a certain extent, Yi Xian was the swordsman's nemesis. At this moment, a voice resounded in the sword hall again. Use the second box. The second box. Below, the old man in black did not hesitate this time. He once again formed a sword seal and soon the ground not far behind him suddenly left, and then a black box floated out. The second trump card. The old man in black glanced at the white little fellow not far away, and his expression was extremely ugly. He did not expect that the helper he called out would actually help Yi Xian. Not only did he not expect this, but the entire sword sect's powerhouses also did not expect this. This white little fellow actually helped Yi Xian save someone. At this moment they had no time to think about this because the sword was already too fast. Not only was the sword fast but it was also boundlessly strong. Executing Heaven's Sword. At present, it could be said to be the sharpest sword in the four-dimensional universe. In his current state, no one was a match for Yi Xian's sword. As soon as the box was opened, a powerful aura emanated from within it. Yi Xian immediately stopped attacking and then he gazed at the box. A ray of black light suddenly floated out from within it. The surviving swordsman gazed at the ray of black light. The black light dispersed to reveal a little girl. She had 2 horns on her head and a black tail behind her. Hope appeared in the eyes of all the experts of the sword sect when they saw her. She was formidable. The aura she emanated was too formidable. Just his aura alone had forced Yi Xian to stop the evil aura and killing intent emanating from him. Not only that, but everyone present had even felt a formless pressure. She was formidable. That was the first thought that came to everyone's mind. The little girl stretched her back, and then she suddenly gazed at Yi Xian who stood nearby. She was slightly stunned when she saw Yi Xian and then she said, "You?" Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of her, and he swiftly slashed his sword at her. The little girl didn't dodge and just allowed Yi Xian's sword to strike her head. Bang! Everyone watched as Yi Xian's figure was blasted flying. The other swordsmen were petrified when they witnessed this scene. She took a strike from Yi Xian head-on? And she's even fine? Everyone was looking at the little girl and their hearts were filled with shock. After all, they'd witnessed Yi Xian's sword. Yi Xian's strength was extremely formidable, and it was especially so for Yi Xian's sword. That sword was extremely sharp. However, the little girl had actually used her head to take a strike from Yi Xian's sword and remained fine. The little girl rubbed her head, and then she gazed at the executing Heaven's sword in Yi Xian's hand. Executing Heaven's sword. As she spoke, she gazed at Yi Xian. Why have you become like this as well? Yi Xian didn't speak. He just appeared in front of the little girl again, and then he slashed his sword at her again. This time he'd utilized the boundless sword. The expressions of everyone in the surroundings instantly changed when they saw this attack. However, the little girl didn't attack and she just allowed the sword to strike her head. Bang! The space around Yi Xian and the little girl collapsed. Moreover, a powerful force swept out like a storm, and the experts of the sword sect hurriedly retreated. When they stopped moving, they gazed at the little girl. At this moment, the little girl was still completely fine. Conversely, Yi Xian's sword and hand were actually trembling violently. The others instantly heaved sighs of relief when they witnessed this scene. Meanwhile, Yi Xian was about to attack again. However, the little girl suddenly grabbed executing Heaven's sword, and then she kicked Yi Xian's stomach. As if she'd thought of something, she suddenly withdrew her leg and moved over 10 back to put some distance between her and Yi Xian. On the other hand, the executing Heaven's sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly transformed into a ray of light that slashed at the little girl. The little girl immediately grabbed onto executing Heaven's sword, and she forcefully resisted the powerful force contained within it. The little girl glanced at Yi Xian, and then she gazed at the little fellow who was standing not too far away. Heal him. The little white fellow blinked and then she pointed at Yi Ling. The little girl nodded, all right. As she spoke, she turned around and then her brows knit together slightly. The sword sect. When she spoke up to this point, she gazed at Yi Xian. "Why are you fighting the sword sect?" Yi Xian didn't speak and he was just about to attack again. Meanwhile, the little girl suddenly charged over to Yi Xian, and then she pressed her palm against Yi Xian's shoulder. In an instant, the vicious energy and killing intent that Yi Xian emanated were instantly suppressed by her. It didn't take long for Yi Xian to regain his senses. Meanwhile, the black-clothed old man, the swordsman, suddenly appeared in front of the little girl. He didn't attack the little girl, and he just smashed his fist towards Yi Xian's head with the intention of killing Yi Xian with a single strike. However, right when his fist was about to smash against Yi Xian's head, the little girl suddenly smashed her fist towards the old man. The old man's expression changed drastically, and he hurriedly withdrew his fist to block it. Bang! The old man was instantly blasted flying, and his arms even exploded apart. The experts of the sword sect were stunned on the spot when they witnessed this scene. What's going on? Chapter 837. The old man was stunned by the little girl's punch as well. What's the meaning of this? All the experts of the sword sect gazed at the little girl in succession. Is she a helper from our sect? She's probably Yi Xian's helper, right? The old man stared fixedly at the little girl, and he clenched his fists tightly. Aren't you supposed to be protecting my sword sect? He was furious. Extremely furious. That white little fellow had helped Yi Xian earlier, and now this little girl was helping Yi Xian as well. What's going on? The little girl glanced at the old man. Why did all of you hit him? Don't all of you know that he's my older brother's subordinate? My older brother's subordinate? The old man frowned slightly. What do you mean? The little girl pointed angrily at the old man. Why did all of you hit him? Hearing this, the black-clothed old man was dumbfounded. Why did we hit Yi Xian? His mind was completely short-circuited. Is this the trump card that the sword sect's founding ancestor left behind for the sword sect? The experts of the sword sect were in a state of confusion as well. What's going on? Is this the sword sect's helper or Yi Xian's? Meanwhile, a nearby swordsman stepped forward, and he forcefully suppressed the rage in his heart. Didn't you see that? It was he who slaughtered in my sword sect, and it wasn't my sword sect that hit him. The little girl gazed at Yi Xian. Meanwhile, Xiaoling suddenly appeared in front of the little girl, and she hurriedly told her everything. A short moment later, the little girl glanced at Yi Ling, and her expression gradually turned cold. After that, she turned around to look at the nearby swordsman. All of you hit his younger sister first. The swordsman's expression was slightly unsightly. Who exactly are you helping? The little girl suddenly stomped her right foot against the ground. Bang! The swordsman's body exploded apart before he could even react. The swordsman's expression changed drastically when they saw this. The little girl glanced coldly at the experts of the sword sect. You actually dared to hit my younger sister? How shameless. Moreover, the people you beat up are my brother's people. The black-clothed old man coldly looked at the little girl. Who is your brother? The little girl pointed at the statue not far away. He's my brother. Seeing this scene, the black-robed old man and the others were stunned. Wasn't this their patriarch? Meanwhile, a swordsman spoke solemnly. That's the founding ancestor of our sword sect. Since he's your elder brother, why don't you help us? The little girl looked at the swordsman. I've calculated your relationship with my brother and his relationship with my brother. I realize that he's closer to my brother, so I'll help him. Everyone, the black-robed old man slowly clenched his fists. You said that he is closer to your brother. Why do you say that? The little girl shrugged. Anyway, they're closer. The black-clothed old man spoke solemnly. He intends to kill us. The little girl said, then let him kill us. The black-clothed old man almost spat out a mouthful of blood when he heard this. Let him kill us? My God, what did I just say? At this moment, the black-clothed old man felt like his brain wasn't enough to comprehend all of this. Suddenly, Yi Xian, who stood by the little girl's side, gazed at the black-clothed old man. A moment later, he transformed into a ray of light that shot explosively towards the black-clothed old man. The black-clothed old man's expression changed drastically when he witnessed this scene. How could he dare to resist Yi Xian's attack? He immediately retreated madly. However, Yi Xian didn't pursue him, and Yi Xian went after the other experts of the sword sect instead. It didn't take long for numerous shrill cries to resound once more. They couldn't stop Yi Xian at all. Yi Xian. Yi Xian's sword was too terrifying. The little girl blinked, hesitated for a moment and said, why don't we sit down and have a chat? Yi Xian ignored her and continued killing. The little girl thought for a moment and said, don't injure yourself. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and walked towards the white little fellow. Yi Xian was still slaughtering in the distance. While the experts of the sword sect were resisting him, their swords couldn't pose a threat to Yi Xian at all. Even some of the formidable sword formations of the sword sect were unable to harm Yi Xian. Yi Xian was the bane of the swordsmen. Or it should be said that he was the bane of the sword sect. If he encountered any other sect, then Yi Xian would absolutely not slaughter them so wantonly. Because while his combat strength was formidable, the joint forces of 7 or 8 experts at the peak of the Shattering Realm would definitely be able to suppress him. However, the Fate Realm experts of the sword sect felt extremely helpless. They felt extremely helpless, because their swords were useless against Yi Xian. On the other hand, the little girl had walked over to the white little fellow. The white little fellow pointed at Yi Ling, who was lying on the ground with an excited expression on her face. The little girl looked at Yi Ling and blinked. In next to no time, a wisp of surprise flashed through her eyes. When she noticed the little girl, the white little fellow hurriedly waved her little claws as if she was trying to express something. The little girl nodded slightly. What a unique physique. It's amazing. The white little fellow hurriedly nodded in agreement. The little girl looked at the white little fellow. Give her some more violet energy and completely activate her physique. The white little fellow nodded, and then she continued instilling violet energy into Yi Ling. On the other side, Yi Xian had gone mad from the slaughter. At this moment, Yi Xian was enveloped by countless strands of blood energy, and everywhere he passed, heads would fall to the ground. It was truly a bloodbath. Yi Xian's target was the sword sect's sword hall. In other words, the swordsman's location. However, the sword sect's experts were resisting tenaciously, and they were trying to delay until the swordsman came out. The current strongest expert of the sword sect. At this moment, a voice suddenly resounded from within the sword hall. Everyone, retreat to the front of the sword hall and activate the defensive sword formation. The voice of the swordsman. Hearing this, all the sword sect's experts retreated. When they retreated to the front of the sword hall, a huge barrier of light suddenly enveloped the entire sword hall. This barrier of light wasn't formed by sword energy, which meant that Yi Xian couldn't absorb it at all. In front of the sword hall were the sword sect's experts, and there were only a few dozen of them. Outside the sword hall was Yi Xian, and the ground around Yi Xian was covered in blood and corpses. Yi Xian was surrounded by a bloody glow, and the executing heaven sword in his hand was horribly red as if it was forged from blood. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly walked to the barrier of light and slashed down. Bang! The barrier of light shook violently and countless cracks appeared on it. However, it didn't shatter. Yi Xian slashed down again. Rumble. The barrier of light shook once more and the cracks grew larger. However, it still stood firm. Yi Xian was about to attack again when he suddenly transformed into a ray of light that vanished into the distance. The swordsmen were slightly stunned by this scene. What's Yi Xian trying to do? In next to no time, all of them seemed to have thought of something, and their expressions changed drastically. One of the swordsmen spoke with horror. His targets are the disciples of our sword sect. He just finished speaking when the howl of swords resounded from afar. The black-clothed old man who led the group roared furiously, Yi Xian, you think you can do that? Come at us. Yi Xian didn't even pay attention to him, and he just slaughtered the disciples of the sword sect. How could these disciples of the sword sect be a match for Yi Xian? They couldn't fight back at all. Yi Xian immediately started slaughtering, and shrill cries resounded incessantly. On the other hand, the experts of the sword sect who were trapped within the barrier of light had extremely unsightly expressions on their faces. They wanted to leave the barrier, but they were very clearly aware that it would be useless even if they did, because they couldn't stop Yi Xian. Yi Xian was still slaughtering. At this point, he'd killed a few dozen, and all of them were genius disciples of the sword sect. Even though they weren't strong enough right now, they were the future hope of the sword sect. At this moment, the black-clothed old man in the light shield suddenly rushed out. The black-clothed old man glared at Yi Xian in the distance. Both of his hands had been chopped off by the little girl, so he had no hands at the moment. However, there was not a hint of fear in the black-robed old man's eyes. The black-clothed old man walked slowly towards Yi Xian. Yi Xian, do you only attack the weak? You. His voice suddenly stopped abruptly. This was because a blood-red sword had been stabbed into his throat at some point in time. It was an instant kill. The black-clothed old man's eyes were filled with disbelief. He intended to say something, but Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of him, and then Yi Xian swung the execution heaven sword horizontally. The black-clothed old man's head flew into the air. After he beheaded the black-clothed old man, Yi Xian transformed into a ray of blood-red light that shot towards the barrier of light, and then he swung his sword down. Bang! The barrier of light shook violently, and then countless cracks appeared on it. Yi Xian didn't waste his breath at all. He just swung his sword a few more times in succession, and more cracks appeared on the barrier of light. The expressions of the experts of the sword sect who were trapped within the barrier of light had changed when they witnessed this scene. Once the barrier of light was destroyed, then could anyone stop Yi Xian? No one. Defend the formation. Meanwhile, Jian Mu's voice resounded once more within the hall. The others hurriedly utilized their sword energy to defend the formation when they heard Jian Mu. They didn't dare allow their sword energy to leave the barrier of light because it would be absorbed by Yi Xian if it left the barrier of light. Just like that, Yi Xian continued slashing madly for around 15 minutes. Even though the barrier of light was covered in countless cracks, it still didn't shatter. The members of the sword sect instantly heaved sighs of relief when they witnessed this scene. Right at this moment, the space between Yi Xian's brows suddenly flashed. In the next moment, the space here started to reform layer by layer. The spatial Dao law. Under the influence of the spatial Dao law, the barrier of light actually started to disintegrate bit by bit. The expressions of the experts of the sword sect changed drastically when they witnessed this scene, and they retreated explosively. It didn't take long for the barrier of light to vanish without a trace. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly vanished on the spot. At the instant he vanished, a blood-red ray of light slashed through the air. The swordsman experts who led the group were instantly beheaded. Yi Xian was just about to continue attacking when an invisible pressure suddenly swept out from within the hall. Bang! Yi Xian was instantly blasted back by this aura, and he retreated until he stood before the little girl and the white fellow. An old man walked over from afar. It was none other than Jian Mu. At this moment, Jian Mu had recovered his physical body. Jian Mu walked slowly towards Yi Xian with an extremely gloomy expression on his face. The little girl who stood by Yi Xian's side suddenly gazed at the white fellow. "I'll go help him." As soon as she finished speaking, she stood up. P.S. The weather has suddenly turned cold and it's brightening later than usual. Chapter 838. She walked over to Yi Xian's side, but Yi Xian immediately slashed his sword at her. However, the little girl pressed her hand down on his shoulder, and this action instantly suppressed the energy of his bloodline. However, it was only temporarily suppressed and hadn't been completely suppressed. The little girl gazed at Jian Mu, and the latter spoke in a low voice. "Both of you are trump cards left behind by the founding ancestor of my sword sect. Logically speaking, both of you should be protecting my sword sect, right?" The little girl asked. "Why did both of you hit him?" Obviously she was referring to Yi Xian. Jian Mu gazed at her. "You know him?" The little girl nodded. "I do." Jian Mu's eyes narrowed slightly. "You actually know him?" "What?" The little girl was just about to speak when Yi Xian suddenly started trembling, and the energy of his bloodline grew stronger and stronger. The little girl's brows knit together slightly. Meanwhile, Jian Mu said, "How did you know him?" The little girl glanced at Jian Mu. "Let me ask you a question. Did you hit his younger sister?" Jian Mu gazed at her. "Yes." The little girl flared up with rage. "How shameless." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly swung her fist through the air. Jian Mu's expression changed and he swiftly slashed with his sword. Bang! In an instant, Jian Mu was blasted flying. Moreover, the sword hall behind him was instantly transformed into powder. The others in the surroundings were astounded when they witnessed this scene. That little girl's strength is actually so formidable. Jian Mu's face was covered in astonishment as well. He hadn't expected that the little girl's strength would actually be so terrifying. That punch had directly injured his internal organs. The little girl glanced at Jian Mu with an emotionless expression. "You hit his younger sister. How shameless." Jian Mu's expression was extremely unsightly. "Why are both of you helping him?" He couldn't figure it out. Both the little girl and the white fellow were trump cards left behind by the sword sect's founding ancestor, and the sword sect had never utilized them. If it wasn't for the sake of keeping Yi Xian busy just now, the sword sect wouldn't have utilized them as well. However, he didn't expect that these two little fellas would actually help Yi Xian. Help Yi Xian. Why was that? The little girl took out a stick of candied hawthorn and licked it before saying, "He's one of us." "I don't know you." When he spoke up to here, he paused slightly and said, "That Lin Chi, where's little Lin?" Jianmu's pupils suddenly constricted when he heard this. Lunch. Actually, the sword sect wasn't founded by the green-clothed man, it was founded by Lin Qi. However, after Lin Qi founded the sword sect, he directly appointed the green-clothed man as the founding ancestor. So, the entire sword sect had no choice but to acknowledge the green-clothed man as the founding ancestor. However, the real founder of the sword sect was Lynch. Jianmu never imagined that this little girl actually knew Lin Qi and even called him Little Lin. Who was this person in front of them? The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it was. Jianmu was just about to speak when the little girl suddenly said, "You wanted to seize his treasures but you couldn't do anything to him, so you went to deal with his younger sister, right?" Everyone in the surroundings gazed at Jianmu when they heard this. Actually, most of the members of the sword sect weren't aware of the sequence of events. They only knew that Yi Xian had come to the sword sect to kill, but they didn't know why Yi Xian had come to the sword sect to kill. Yet now, the little girl's words allowed them to understand that Yi Xian hadn't come to kill for no reason. Jianmu gazed at the little girl. "I shouldn't have let you out." At this moment he was truly regretful. He didn't regret going against Yi Xian, and he regretted letting this little girl and that white-colored little fellow out. Especially this little girl's strength was too terrifying. The little girl laughed coldly when she heard Jianmu. "You dared to touch Brother Yang's people? Looks to me like you're tired of living." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly vanished on the spot. Jianmu's expression instantly changed drastically when he witnessed this scene. He suddenly took a step forward while he pressed his palms together, and then an energy sword that was over 10 m long suddenly condensed above him. In the next moment, the energy sword carried an obliterating force as it slashed down forcefully. Meanwhile, the little girl just happened to appear in front of him, and she smashed her fist forward. Bang! The energy sword exploded apart. At the same time, Jianmu was blasted flying, and the little girl smashed her fist forward once more. Bang! In the distance, Jianmu's entire body had been sent flying thousands of meters away, and the space in front of her and Jianmu had already turned pitch black. The might of a single punch was so formidable. The expressions of the experts of the sword sect were extremely unsightly. Yi Xian was already sufficiently terrifying, but this little girl was even more terrifying than Yi Xian. The little girl was about to attack again when Jianmu suddenly spoke fiercely. "What? Do you want my sword sect to be annihilated?" The little girl's beautiful brows knit together slightly when she heard this, and then she stopped. Annihilate the sword sect? She hadn't thought of that. After all, the sword sect had acknowledged her older brother as its founding ancestor. It wouldn't be good to annihilate it just like that. Jianmu heaved a slight sigh of relief when he saw the little girl hesitate. He wasn't really afraid of Yi Xian, but he was really quite afraid of the little girl. After all, her strength was truly too terrifying. Most importantly, her defenses were extremely formidable. Her physical defenses were formidable to an extremely terrifying degree, and there were probably very few people in the fourth dimension who could penetrate her defenses. Suddenly the little girl said, "I've thought of a way." Jianmu gazed at her and the little girl stared back at him. "I'll kill you and then?" As she spoke, she pointed at Yi Xian, "Then make him the sect master of the sword sect." Jianmu was speechless. Everyone else was speechless. Make Yi Xian the sect master? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it was a good idea. So, she gazed at Jianmu, "But I have to kill you before that. Otherwise, he might not be able to become the sect master." As soon as she finished speaking, she was about to attack. However, a formidable aura suddenly emanated from Yi Xian. The little girl's brows knit together slightly when she witnessed this scene. Because she noticed that she was slightly unable to suppress Yi Xian's bloodline. The energy of that bloodline was attacking her strength once more. If she were to attack, then that bloodline would erupt once more. The little girl thought for a moment, and then she gazed at the white fellow who stood not too far away. "Should I heal him first?" The white fellow blinked, and then she pointed her little claw lightly at Yiling. Obviously, what she meant was that she couldn't spare her claw right now. The little girl gazed at Yi Xian with a slightly helpless expression. She had to suppress Yi Xian's bloodline right now. Otherwise, if she didn't, then Yi Xian might kill everyone in the sword sect. That wasn't something she wanted to see happen. She only wanted to kill Jianmu, and then give the position of sword sect leader to Yi Xian. In this way it would be the best of both worlds. Right at this moment, Jianmu suddenly opened his palm, and then he pressed it down lightly. A ray of white light shot out from the ruins of the sword hall. A ray of white light suddenly shot into the sky. Everyone looked at the ray of white light because it was the sword sect's final trump card. Actually, all the experts of the sword sect were slightly panicked. What would they do if their final trump card helped Yi Xian as well? What should they do? They would only be doomed. The little girl gazed at the ray of white light as well, and there was a trace of bewilderment in her eyes. Suddenly, her pupils constricted slightly, and then she pulled Yi Xian behind her and smashed her fist forward. At the instant that the little girl's fist collided with the ray of white light, a fine and imperceptible ray of light suddenly flew out from within the ray of white light. Bang! The little girl took Yi Xian with her as she retreated explosively. The space where Yi Xian and she retreated was instantly obliterated, and both Yi Xian and her retreated by over 10 kilometers. The others in the surroundings were shocked when they witnessed this scene, and they gazed at the ray of white light. However, they were unable to see anything at all. The white little fellow was gazing at the ray of white light as well, and there was a trace of bewilderment in her eyes. The little girl stopped moving and she glanced at her fist. Her fist had turned red. On the other side, Jianmu's face was extremely gloomy when he witnessed this scene. He hadn't imagined that the little girl's physical body would actually be strong to such an extent. The little girl gazed at the ray of white light in the sky, and there was nothing within it. She couldn't see anything at all. The little girl slowly clenched her right fist. It wasn't left behind by my older brother. When she spoke up to hear, she gazed at Jianmu. It's the energy of another world. Another world. Jianmu stared fixedly at the little girl. You actually know of another world. The little girl grunted coldly. She put away the candied fruit in her left hand, and then she slowly clenched her fists. Right at this moment, the ray of white light in the sky suddenly shook, and then the little girl suddenly pushed her arms forward. Bang! The space around the little girl and Yi Xian collapsed. At the same time, a strand of blood-red flames instantly enveloped the little girl and Yi Xian. Jianmu stared fixedly at that area in the distance. Right at this moment, a formidable force suddenly erupted from that area, and then the blood-red flames surged towards the surroundings. Everywhere the flames passed, space was instantly incinerated into nothingness. Meanwhile, the little girl walked over with Yi Xian in her hand. She was still utilizing a portion of her energy to suppress Yi Xian's bloodline. Jianmu's expression instantly turned gloomy when he saw the little girl. Because he noticed that the blood-red flames actually hadn't harmed the little girl at all. She wasn't in her main body. How terrifying would she be if her main body was here? Jianmu didn't dare imagine it. Meanwhile, the little girl suddenly raised her head to gaze at the white light, and then she suddenly smashed her fist upwards. Bang! The white light trembled violently, and an invisible power surged out of it. This power actually shattered the little girl's power. Not only that, but it also arrived in front of the little girl. The little girl smashed her fist forward once more. Bang! The force was directly blasted apart while the white light in the sky merely trembled slightly, yet it wasn't damaged at all. Jianmu stared fixedly at the little girl and said, "You can't stop it." The little girl glanced coldly at Jianmu and said, "Have I ever feared anyone?" Meanwhile, the little white fellow suddenly waved her little claw and seemed to be saying something. The little girl fell silent for a moment before she said, "Besides my big sister and my older brother, and that woman, have I ever feared anyone?" The Sword Sage. Chapter 839. When had she ever been afraid of anyone? Besides those 3 people that she'd spoken about, she'd never been afraid of anyone. Even if the ray of white light before her was the energy of another world. Jianmu laughed ferociously when he heard the little girl. "All right, then let me see how monstrous you are." As soon as he finished speaking, he moved aside. Meanwhile, the ray of white light in the sky suddenly started trembling. The little girl gazed at it. "White, can you heal this fellow first? Otherwise, I won't be able to exert my full strength." She was using most of her strength to suppress Yi Xian's bloodline. Snowy shook her head instead. She couldn't leave Yi Ling right now. Because numerous mysterious auras had appeared on Yi Ling, and Yi Ling was still madly absorbing her violet energy. If her violet energy was cut off, then all her efforts would be in vain. "I can't leave." At the same time, her body had started to gradually become illusory because she was madly transferring violet energy to Yi Ling. The little girl puckered her lips. How troublesome. Meanwhile, the ray of white light suddenly trembled, and then a snow-white ray of light suddenly slashed down from within it. At the instant that this ray of light appeared, the space here had instantly become illusory. No, the entire sword dimension had become illusory. It couldn't endure the might of this ray of light. The little girl's eyes narrowed slightly, I can't be bothered with you anymore." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly transformed into a ray of black light that shot into the sky. She didn't swing her fist and she just smashed her head against the ray of light. In next to no time, the ray of light slashed against her pair of black horns. Bang! The ray of light instantly exploded apart. However, the little girl was blasted back to the spot by the powerful force within the ray of light. Bang! The ground where the little girl stood exploded apart. At the same time, her body gradually became illusory as well. It was a consumption. Both she and the white fellow weren't in their true forms. So, every single time they utilized their strength, it was a form of consumption to them. Without the support of their true forms, they would vanish once the consumption increased. A savage smile arose on the corners of Jianmu's mouth when he saw the little girl's body gradually become illusory. "Aren't you very good at fighting? Continue." The little girl glanced at Jianmu. "I'll kill you first." As soon as she finished speaking, she disappeared on the spot. In the distance, Jianmu's expression changed. He waved his right hand and a wave of sword light rippled out from his hand. However, this stretch of sword light was directly shattered by the little girl's fist. Not only that, but he was also blasted away by this powerful force. The little girl was about to attack again when another saber light flew out from the white light in the sky. The little girl suddenly raised her head and punched upwards. Boom! The saber light exploded and turned into nothingness. The little girl's body became even more illusory. Sensing this, the little girl slightly frowned. In the air, another saber light slashed down. The little girl looked up and punched out. Just like that, as more and more saber lights appeared, the little girl's body became more and more illusory. In the end, she was almost transparent. At this moment, the little girl suddenly stopped. She looked at the white light in the distance. "I'm so angry." As she spoke, she gazed at the white little fellow, and she was just about to speak when her figure vanished. The white little fellow blinked, and her body had become completely illusory. She looked down at Yi Ling, and then she suddenly opened her mouth and spat. Countless strands of violet energy surged madly from her mouth, and they surged into Yi Ling's body. After Yi Ling's body madly absorbed the violet energy, she suddenly clenched her fists tightly. However, the white little fellow was growing more and more illusory. Meanwhile, Jianmu suddenly gazed at Yi Ling. As he gazed at Yi Ling, who was lying on the ground, a strand of uneasiness suddenly arose in his heart, and it was growing stronger and stronger. Danger. Terror. That was what he felt right now. He didn't have such a feeling even when he faced the little girl just now. After a moment of silence, Jianmu suddenly said, "Kill the little girl first. Kill the little girl first." The white light in the sky suddenly trembled violently, and then a flying knife suddenly flew out. This time, the flying knife's target was Yi Ling. Yi Ling, who was below, suddenly opened her eyes. However, her eyes were completely white. The white little fellow was shocked when she saw Yi Ling suddenly open her eyes, and then she blinked and lightly tapped Yi Ling. However, Yi Ling didn't react. The expanse of white in Yi Ling's eyes suddenly started to revolve like a white vortex. The white little fellow's claws trembled, and then she hesitated for a moment before continuing to transfer violet energy to Yi Ling. Moreover, the flying knife had arrived above them. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly appeared above them. As soon as Yi Xian raised his head, an expanse of blood-red light surged out from his eyes. However, the blood-red light exploded upon contact with the flying knife, and then the flying knife slashed towards Yi Xian. Yi Xian swiftly raised his sword with both hands to block it. Bang! The space in the surroundings trembled violently, and then it cracked apart. A strand of blood essence sprayed out from Yi Xian's mouth. At the same time, his arms had cracked apart like a spider's web, and fresh blood sprayed from them. However, the flying knife had vanished. Meanwhile, the white little fellow was growing more and more illusory because she'd emanated too much violet energy. Right when she was about to vanish, the little fellow gazed at Yi Ling. Yi Ling's hair had suddenly turned silver. Moreover, there was a small crack between her brows, and this crack wasn't just madly absorbing the violet energy, it was even absorbing the spirit energy in the heavens and the earth. Jianmu's expression changed when he witnessed this scene, and his intuition told him that something bad was about to occur. Jianmu raised his head to look at the white light, and he practically roared furiously. "Kill that little girl first. Kill her." The white light trembled slightly in midair, and then it started revolving. In next to no time, an invisible pressure slowly seeped out from it, and it seemed like something was approaching. In the distance, the white little fellow gazed at Yi Xian, waved her little claw and then vanished completely. After she vanished, A strand of violet light directly entered the center of Yi Ling's brows. Yi Ling's sleeves had suddenly transformed into ash, and then numerous tiny blood-red talismans had suddenly appeared on her tiny arms. These talismans were extremely strange and they seemed to be converging something. Moreover, the light in the surroundings had suddenly dimmed down while chilly winds blew in waves. It seemed like something was wailing and it was an extremely horrifying sight. Jianmu's expression changed drastically when he witnessed this scene, and he roared madly with fury. Kill her! Kill her! Because the uneasiness in his heart was growing stronger and stronger. Terror. Presently, deep terror filled the depths of his heart. His intuition told him that something terrible would occur if the little girl didn't die. In midair, a saber suddenly flew out from within the expanse of white light. At the instant this saber appeared, the sword world in an area of a few thousands of kilometers suddenly started to collapse inch by inch. The expressions of Jianmu and the other experts of the sword sect changed drastically when they witnessed this scene, and Jianmu shouted furiously, "Do you intend to kill us as well?" There was no reply. The saber slashed down slowly from midair. Everywhere it passed, space was transformed into nothingness, and the sword world was utterly unable to endure this force and started to collapse inch by inch. Countless experts of the sword sect were horrified, and they hurriedly tried to protect themselves. Jianmu's expression changed drastically as well because he hadn't expected that the saber would actually be so formidable. The entire sword world would be destroyed if this saber descended. After hesitating for a short while, Jianmu didn't stop it in the end, nor was he able to stop it. Even though he didn't want the sword world to be destroyed, he wanted Yi Xian and Yi Ling to die even more. In the distance, Yi Xian raised his head and looked at the expanse of blood-red light. His right hand held tightly onto Executioner Heaven while his arms were still in a cracked state. The injuries he suffered were too severe, and even the spring of life couldn't heal them in a short period of time. Below Yi Xian, Yi Ling's eyes had returned to normal. She just looked at Yi Xian with an indifferent and emotionless gaze. The blood-red runes on her arms grew more and more numerous, and they grew brighter and brighter. Moreover, the gloomy winds in the surroundings grew stronger, and the sorrowful voice grew louder as well. It was extremely horrifying. In midair, the saber had arrived above Yi Xian's head. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly slashed his sword upwards. At the instant he attacked, the saber suddenly slashed down. Bang! As soon as the saber and sword collided, Executioner Heaven shook violently while Yi Xian's right arm exploded into a mist of blood. However, the saber hadn't vanished yet. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly held soul-suppressing sword in his left hand and blocked it. Bang! Yi Xian directly smashed into the ground in front of Yi Ling. At this moment, his entire left arm was completely cracked, and his bones could be seen. Not only that, but his entire body had also completely cracked, and he was like a porcelain man that had suffered a heavy blow. However, the saber still didn't disappear. It directly slashed down towards Yi Ling below. If this saber fell, Yi Ling would definitely die. Just when the saber was half a foot away from Yi Ling, Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of Yi Ling. He held Executioner Heaven in his left hand and blocked it. The saber slashed down on Executioner Heaven. Executioner Heaven shook violently, and Yi Xian instantly spat out a mouthful of blood essence. Immediately after, he was directly sent flying. At this moment, the saber slashed straight at Yi Ling. Yi Ling looked at the saber, and there was no color in her eyes at all. The runes on her arm had already spread to her shoulder. Just when the saber was about to slash Yi Ling, Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of Yi Ling and directly hugged Yi Ling. At this moment, the saber pierced through his chest from the back. The tip of the saber had just pierced through Yi Xian's chest when Yi Xian's already broken left hand suddenly covered the tip of the saber tightly, not allowing the saber to penetrate even half an inch. However, the force of the saber was too strong, and the tip of the saber directly pierced through his palm and continued to slash towards Yi Ling. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly roared in anger. His left hand gripped the saber, and countless sword intent and bloodline power enveloped the tip of the saber like a tide. Finally, the saber stopped a few inches away from Yi Ling's eyebrows. Yi Xian suddenly grinned and blood gushed out like a spring. "Don't be afraid, brother, P.S. Here's a small red packet. Remember to snatch it, there are crosscut coins." Chapter 840. A trace of fluctuation had finally appeared in Yi Ling's eyes when he heard Yi Xian. On the other side, Jianmu instantly heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that Yi Xian's chest had been pierced through by the saber. He's finally dead. Regardless of whether it was Yi Ling or Yi Xian, both of them must die. He wouldn't be at ease until they died. Yi Xian's aura was growing weaker and weaker. However, his left hand was still holding tightly onto the blade of the saber, and he didn't allow it to move even an inch further. At this moment, the swordwood in the distance suddenly disappeared. In the next moment, a sword appeared behind Yi Xian. He couldn't wait any longer. Right at this moment, the talisman markings on Yi Ling's arms suddenly converged at her throat, and then, right at this moment, Yi Ling's eyes suddenly turned a strange dark red color. Right when Jian Mu's sword was half an inch away from the back of Yi Xian's head, a hand had suddenly grabbed onto his sword. It was Yi Ling's hand. Jian Mu gazed at Yi Ling with astonishment. He was just about to speak when Yi Ling's hand suddenly clamped down on his throat. Everyone in the surroundings was shocked. Even Jian Mu was inconsolably shocked in his heart. He hadn't even been able to react to it. How could this be possible? Even that horned little girl wasn't able to render him powerless to fight back. Yi Ling gazed at Jian Mu, and her voice was icy cold and completely emotionless. I grant you death. As soon as she finished speaking, Jian Mu's eyes suddenly opened wide. In the next moment, his aura vanished, and he perished on the spot. The experts of the sword sect were stunned when they witnessed this scene, and all of them retreated explosively. Yi Ling glanced at the experts of the sword sect. In the next moment, all of them froze on the spot, and then they fell down one by one. In an instant, a few dozen experts of the sword sect had perished. Yi Ling turned around to gaze at Yi Xian. She just gazed at Yi Xian. At this moment, Yi Xian's aura was growing weaker and weaker. Yi Ling walked over to Yi Xian, and then she opened her palm. The pagoda within Yi Xian's body had appeared in her palm. Her beautiful brows knit together slightly as she gazed at the pagoda in her palm. A short while passed before she turned around and left with the pagoda in her hand. However, she hadn't even taken 2 steps before she stopped, and then she turned around and walked over to Yi Xian. She gazed at Yi Xian for a very long time before she placed her right hand lightly on Yi Xian's shoulder. The talismans on her arms suddenly started to tremble, and it didn't take long for the center of her forehead to split open before a ray of black light suddenly surged into the center of Yi Xian's forehead. As soon as the ray of black light entered his forehead, the bloodline within Yi Xian's body instantly calmed down. Moreover, a strand of black energy started to repair Yi Xian's body. Right at this moment, the ray of white light in the sky suddenly trembled slightly, and then a formidable aura suddenly swept out from within it. Yi Ling ignored that aura and withdrew her hand. At this moment, Yi Xian had already returned to normal, but he still hadn't woken up. At this moment, an illusory hand suddenly stretched out from the ray of white light in the sky. At the moment this hand appeared, the entire sword realm directly collapsed. And the target of this hand was Yi Xian. Yi Ling raised her head to look at the hand, and her eyes suddenly turned black. In the next moment, the hand turned into nothingness. Not only that, but a powerful force directly entered the ray of white light. After a moment of silence, a shocked voice suddenly sounded out from the distant ray of white light. You are the Shura Empress, the last great emperor of the mortal world. How is this possible? Your Excellency, I'm sorry. We have absolutely no ill intentions towards Your Excellency. Please forgive us. The voice was trembling. Yi Ling didn't speak. She suddenly grasped the air with her right hand. Bang! The beam of white light exploded. But then the light disappeared. Then it vanished. Yi Ling looked at the world prison pagoda in her hand, then turned to leave. At this moment, a weak voice came from behind her. Ling? Yi Ling stopped in her tracks. The emotions of the mortal world are worth your life? Yi Xian's consciousness was still a bit hazy. He weakly said, Ling? Don't go. Yi Ling raised her head to look at the horizon. After a moment she turned to look at Yi Xian. Then, the world prison pagoda in her hand suddenly flew in front of him. Save me. I won't take this. When we meet again in the 5th dimension, I definitely won't show mercy. As her voice fell, she suddenly turned into a ray of black light and soared into the sky. In the horizon, space was directly torn apart. In the blink of an eye, Yi Ling directly disappeared into the horizon. Below, Yi Xian was stunned. In the void, Yi Ling shuttled through space. Finally, she arrived at the barrier between the 4th dimension and the 5th dimension. This was the seal that the prophet had left behind. The moment Yi Ling appeared, an illusory, stop, word suddenly floated out. Yi Ling's face was expressionless. She suddenly disappeared from where she stood. Boom. In this empty space, an explosion suddenly sounded. After a moment, the barrier directly split apart. Yi Ling walked in. Behind her, the barrier began to slowly close up. At this moment Yiling's body suddenly trembled. She stopped. Just as the barrier was about to completely close up, she turned to look at it. Her eyes were filled with reluctance. "Brother?" At this moment her eyes suddenly became cold. She looked deeply below her, then turned and left. Below, Yixian just lay on the ground. His eyes were filled with confusion. The Yiling just now was so unfamiliar. He had never felt so unfamiliar before. He knew that the Yiling just now might not be the Yiling he knew. What exactly happened? Yixian could not understand it no matter how he thought about it. However, he was clear about one thing. Yiling had gone to the fifth dimension. And she must have succeeded. After a moment Yixian slowly closed his eyes. He clenched his fists. After a long time he suddenly opened his eyes. To the fifth dimension. No matter what happened to Yiling, he must go to the fifth dimension to find her. Yixian stood up. He waved his right hand and the executing heaven sword flew into his hand. At the same time he put away the prison pagoda and walked outside. At this moment, a group of people was waiting outside the sword realm. The experts of the dual realm sky. The leader was Grand Elder Chen. The moment he saw Yixian come out, Grand Elder Chen's right hand trembled slightly. Because the sword realm was gone. The sword realm was gone. Grand Elder Chen calmed himself down and then walked in front of Yixian. He smiled. "Little friend, this sword sect." Yixian did not speak. He quickly disappeared into the distance. At this moment, Qin Shi suddenly appeared in front of Grand Elder Qin. Qin Shi said in a low voice, "Grand Elder, everyone in the sword sect has fallen. Not a single one survived." Grand Elder Qin was stunned when he heard this. The experts of the dual realm sky were dumbfounded as well. The sword sect, the strongest sect in the fourth dimension, had been annihilated just like that. Yixian did it? Grand Elder Qin and the others became extremely solemn. After Yixian left the sword realm, he returned to the northern region. When they saw Yixian and Lanxiu and the others heaved a heavy sigh of relief. He had returned alive. However, their hearts were still heavy because they did not see Yiling. Yixian returned to his room. Yixian sat quietly in his room. The fifth dimension. He took out the world prison pagoda. He knew that if he wanted to go to the fifth dimension he had to rely on it. Because with his current strength, it was impossible for him to break through the fifth dimension. At this moment, Lian Qian appeared in front of Yixian. She glanced at Yixian and said, "My apologies." She was referring to the fact that he did not come out to help in the sword world. Yixian shook his head. "How can I blame you?" As he spoke, he looked at the world prison pagoda. "How can I use this pagoda to enter the fifth dimension?" Lian Qian was silent. Yixian looked at Lian Qian. Lian Qian said softly, "You reached the fifth dimension. What happened after that?" Yixian was silent. Lian Qian continued, "Even if you go to the fifth dimension now, you won't be able to change anything. Besides, do you know what happened to your sister?" Yixian shook his head. Lian Qian said softly, "I know your sister is very strong." Yixian looked at Lian Qian. Lian Qian had a complicated expression. Her true identity is the Shura Empress of the fifth dimension. She is also the last empress of the human world. Yixian frowned. "Shura Empress? The last empress of the human world?" Lian Qian nodded. "No one knows what her real name is. They only know that she came from the Azura Hell. When she came out, she directly swept away all the emperors of the fifth dimension. After she defeated the strongest emperor of the fifth dimension in 3 moves, no one in the fifth dimension dared to call themselves emperors in front of her. Later on, no one dared to call themselves emperors because they were not worthy in front of her. She is the most powerful woman in the fifth dimension, and also the most powerful woman in the history of the fifth dimension." As she said this, she slightly paused and then continued, "In the fifth dimension no one dares to provoke her. Even the master of the fifth dimension doesn't dare to rashly provoke her. However, what I don't understand is why she appeared in the fourth dimension. Moreover, she became your sister." Yixian suddenly asked, "She is my sister and also the Shura Empress." Lian Qian was silent. Yixian asked again, "What is it?" Lian Qian softly said, "She is your sister but she might not be. This depends on her. However, I feel that she should be. Moreover, she hasn't forgotten everything." Yixian looked at Lian Qian. "What?" Lian Qian solemnly said, "If she was only the Shura Empress she definitely wouldn't have let you go. Moreover, she wouldn't have left this pagoda here. Therefore I feel that she should still be your sister. Otherwise you wouldn't have survived." Yixian was silent. Lian Qian continued, "Even if she reincarnated, You must understand that she reincarnated into your sister in this life. This is something she can't erase. Even if she has the memories of her previous life, this is a fact that cannot be changed. But, as she said this, she paused and then continued, but if you still want to be her brother, you should know how difficult it is. Yi Xian suddenly said, go to the 5th dimension. Lian Qian said, you don't need this pagoda. Yi Xian looked at Lian Qian. Lian Qian solemnly said, you must rely on your own strength to force your way through. Only then can you survive in the 5th dimension. If you use this pagoda to take a shortcut, you won't have the ability to survive there, let alone find your sister. After a moment of silence, Yi Xian said, then I'll force my way through. Force his way through the 5th dimension. Chapter 841. Yi Xian knew what Lian Qian meant. With his current strength, if he borrowed the World Prison Pagoda to go to the 5th dimension, there would only be one result. Waiting for death. With his current strength, it was impossible for him to fight against the experts of the 5th dimension. If he did not use the power of his bloodline, he might not even be able to defeat a life-breaking expert. With this kind of strength, how could he go to the 5th dimension? How could he find his sister Yi Ling? No way. Yi Xian stood up and slowly walked to the side of the house, softly saying, I am still not strong enough. But, what level do I have to reach to be considered strong? Along the way he became stronger and stronger but also weaker and weaker. The stronger his strength, the more people he met and the things he encountered would naturally change. What was considered strong? Invincible in the 4th dimension. However, there was still the 5th dimension. In the 5th dimension, would being invincible in the 4th dimension still be considered invincible? Endless martial path. Endless sword path. This was a road without end. At this time, Lian Qian suddenly said, what you need to do now is to reach the peak of this world. Your sword path should at least reach the mortal realm or touch the mortal realm. Only then will you not be powerless to fight back when you go to the 5th dimension. Because you have this pagoda, it means that your opponents in the 5th dimension are also extremely powerful existences. Saying this, she walked to Yi Xian's side and softly said, you have to understand that going to the 5th dimension might be a new beginning for you, but it might also be the end. Because the experts of the 5th dimension will not give you a chance. They know your background and know that there are people behind you. They will not look down on you like the experts of the 4th dimension. If they attack you, they will definitely use their full strength because the World Prison Pagoda is too important to them. World Prison Pagoda. As if thinking of something, Lian Qian softly sighed, those people will really go crazy because Master's Universal Library is an irresistible temptation for them. Yi Xian suddenly asked, this time the people behind the sword sect should be experts of the 5th dimension. Miss Lian Qian, do you know who they are? Lian Qian was silent. Just as Yi Xian was about to say something, Lian Qian suddenly said, when you reach the 5th dimension in the future, you will naturally know. Yi Xian nodded. I understand. At this moment a woman walked over. Enlancio. Enlancio walked over to Yi Xian and said in a light voice, are you all right? Yi Xian shook his head. I'm fine. Enlancio nodded and said in a light voice, don't do that next time. Yi Xian said softly, we must all live well. Enlancio nodded. All of you must live well. Yi Xian walked to the front of the hall, and he gazed at the distant horizon for a long time before he said softly, I'm going to the Sword World. As soon as he finished speaking, he disappeared. Sword World. At this moment, the Sword World had turned pitch black. Yi Xian looked around. In the end, he found some swords in this pitch black space. The sword left behind by the sword sect. There were more than 20 of them. Since these swords were able to be preserved, they were naturally extraordinary. However, these 20 swords weren't complete, and they were slightly damaged. After he put the 20 swords away, Yi Xian turned around and left. In the end, he arrived at a deserted mountain range. Devour. Yi Xian directly devoured all 20 swords. Actually, his body had already undergone a tremendous change. It was an earth-shattering change. Because he'd devoured too many swords and sword chi while he was in the sword sect. However, this energy had been forcefully suppressed by Yi Ling. At that time, Yi Ling had actually suppressed his bloodline. However, she was too strong, and she'd directly suppressed all the energy within his body. Now, as soon as he devoured these swords, the energy within his body suddenly erupted. Bang! Countless strands of sword chi suddenly appeared around Yi Xian, and his body actually started to transform layer by layer. Yi Xian was stunned when he noticed this scene. What's going on? Bang! A surge of sword intent suddenly surged out of his body, and then this sword intent directly enveloped him. Under the envelopment of this sword intent, a tiny strand of sword chi actually appeared within his skin. Yi Xian was shocked, and this change made him slightly panic. However, he quickly calmed down because he knew that this might be related to the invincible sword body that the plain-dressed woman had given him. Could it be that he was going to transform? Yi Xian thought about it, and then let the sword intent and sword chi transform his body. At this moment he suddenly felt waves of pain in his body, as if he was being pricked by countless needles. Yi Xian was shocked, and he hurriedly began to absorb the spring of life within the prison pagoda. As soon as this spring of life came into contact with his body, it was directly absorbed cleanly. Soon, the spring of life within the prison pagoda disappeared at a speed that could be seen with the naked eye. After absorbing an endless amount of spring of life, Yi Xian discovered that the pain did not disappear, and on the contrary it was getting worse. At this moment he had no time to care about the changes in his body, because it was too painful. He had never felt such pain before, as if all the nerves in his body were being pricked by needles. What's going on? At this moment Yi Xian was still a little confused. This continued for about a day and a night, and during this day and night he experienced hellish torture, and there were many times when he wanted to die. Because that kind of pain was really too unbearable. At noon, he felt that the pain in his body had greatly lessened. At this moment, Lian Qian suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. She looked at Yi Xian and her brows slightly furrowed. Oh? Yi Xian looked at Lian Qian. What is it? Lian Qian glanced at Yi Xian, and her expression became somewhat solemn. Your body? Yi Xian slowly stood up and he glanced at his body. In the next moment he was directly stunned. At this moment his body hadn't changed at all. However, if one took a closer look, one would notice that his skin actually contained boundless sword energy and sword intent. His body now seemed to be formed by sword energy and sword intent. Invincible sword physique. At this moment he truly understood what it meant to be invincible sword physique. His current physique was equivalent to the sword physique, but as for whether it was invincible or not, he wasn't particularly sure. At this moment, Lian Qian suddenly said, "This cultivation technique of yours is really strange. Now that your body, sword intent, and sword energy have merged into one, it can be said that your current physical body has become extremely strong to an extremely terrifying degree. Try using that sword of yours." Hearing this, Yi Xian suddenly took out the executing heaven sword and slashed at his body. Sizzle. A ray of fiery light flickered on his body. Moreover, his body was completely unharmed. However, a lot of sword intent and sword energy had disappeared, but he could immediately replenish them. Lian Qian said, "Your physical body is amazing." Yi Xian nodded slightly. Deep down he was also extremely shocked. His current physical body could be said to be extremely strong. It should be known that even the executing heaven sword couldn't cut through him. Apart from that, his cultivation stage had also changed. He had directly advanced from the extreme creation stage to the earth celestial stage. As for his physical body, his current physical body could no longer be measured by cultivation stage. His current physical body could definitely resist the strength of a powerhouse at the level of Mu Qingfeng. Not only Mu Qingfeng, but even a powerhouse at the level of Jian Mu would not be able to easily destroy his physical body. Apart from that, if he were to face a swordsman now, as long as it wasn't an extremely strong swordsman, he would be in an invincible position. Of course he didn't dare to be complacent. After all, there were countless powerhouses in this world. If he really encountered a swordsman at the level of the sword master at the top of the pagoda and underestimated his enemy, then he would really be courting death. Even though his strength had improved greatly, Yi Xian knew that it was far from enough. Yi Xian gazed at Lian Qian, and the latter fell silent for a moment before she said, "You have to stop your cultivation for a while. You can only charge towards the life realm after it's stabilized. During this period you have to strengthen 3 things. Firstly, your sword Dao. Secondly, your sword technique. Thirdly, your sword domain. That's your core. Especially your sword technique. You don't just have to cultivate your boundless sword well, you have to cultivate your single strike of life and death well as well." Single strike of life and death. Yi Xian fell silent. He naturally hadn't forgotten this sword technique because it was the woman in a plain dress who taught him this sword technique. However, he'd rarely used this sword technique since he'd utilized the boundless sword. Isn't this single strike of life and death strong? The woman in a plain dress's sword technique is definitely strong. Meanwhile, Lian Qian said, "I've been studying your single strike of life and death lately, and I noticed that this sword technique can be said to have no upper limit. It has no upper limit, but it's very difficult to bring forth its true might. Yet now both your strength and sword technique have improved greatly. So long as you're able to comprehend the essence of this sword technique, then you'll be able to bring forth its true might. Yi Xian nodded. I understand. Lian Qian shook her head. You still don't fully understand it. You have to remember that this sword technique doesn't have an upper limit, but it doesn't have a lower limit as well. If you're unable to truly understand its essence, then you'll be unable to bring forth its true might. Yi Xian fell silent. Single strike of life and death. He'd heard from the woman in a plain dress that the might of this sword technique depended on one's attitude. Once this sword technique was executed, one's opponent would live and die according to its will. This was the core of this sword technique. It sounded very simple, but how difficult was it to accomplish? Single strike of life and death. From his point of view, this sword technique was meant for the strong to use against the weak. Only the strong would have such a disdainful state of mind towards the weak. How could a person with lower strength be able to decide the life and death of another person with a single strike? However, he also understood that the woman in a plain dress must have had her reasons for teaching him this sword technique. So here's the problem. How was he supposed to use this sword skill? Yi Xian fell into deep thought. Lian Qian retreated to the side and didn't disturb Yi Xian. Lian Qian looked at the horizon with a trace of worry in her eyes. Yi Xian would definitely go to the fifth dimension. And once Yi Xian went to the fifth dimension, one must know that the current fifth dimension no longer had a prophet. It was no longer the fifth dimension that she was familiar with. Chapter 842. In the mountain range, Yi Xian sat on top of a mountain with a sword floating in front of him. One sword to decide life and death. At that moment, his mind kept replaying the scene of the plain-dressed woman killing people. How did the plain-dressed woman kill people? Contempt. In the eyes of the plain-dressed woman, it was disregard for life. In her eyes, everyone was like an ant. Confidence. At the end of the day, it was confidence. Of course, the reason why she was confident was because of her strength. Therefore, the core of this one sword to decide life and death was strength. However, other than strength, there was another core, and that was confidence. When facing an enemy, one must have confidence. Even if one could not win, one must have the confidence to kill with one sword. This was not deceiving oneself. If one did not have confidence, one would not be able to achieve anything. Confidence did not mean one had to be blindly confident. If one was blindly confident, one would be deceiving oneself and others. Yi Xian extended his hand and held the executing heaven sword in front of him. Confidence? What was his confidence based on? His backer. One had to admit that there was a time when his confidence was his backer. The plain-dressed woman, Alian, the prison pagoda, the executing heaven sword. To put it simply, his confidence was actually built on external objects and forces. This kind of confidence was superficial and unrealistic. Just like this time at the sword sect, the plain-dressed woman was not there, Alian was not there, and not only did he almost die, but Yi Ling almost died as well. Without external forces, could he still be confident? At that moment, Yi Xian understood a little. His confidence was wrong. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. Along the way, too many people had helped him. As for himself, not only was he not ashamed of it, he was even a little smug. Just think about it, if he didn't have the woman in a simple dress and those people that were helping him from behind, would he be able to survive until now? One must rely on oneself. Rely on oneself. Yi Xian slowly closed his eyes. Lian Qian glanced at Yi Xian but did not say anything. Ever since Yi Ling left, she realized that Yi Xian had changed. As for what had changed, she could not tell. However, this shouldn't be a bad thing. Because she found Yi Xian had not really grown up until then. In the following days, Yi Xian spent every day crazily researching the life and death sword. This was the sword skill that the plainly dressed woman had taught him, and he was going to cultivate it to the extreme. And every time, Lian Qian would guide him from the side. Yi Xian discovered that although Lian Qian's strength wasn't particularly strong, she was very knowledgeable. It could be said that in this four-dimensional universe, there weren't many people who were more knowledgeable than her. Therefore, under Lian Qian's guidance, he could be said to have improved by leaps and bounds. Moreover, the might of this sword that determined life and death was also getting stronger and stronger. Following the destruction of the sword sect, the four-dimensional universe suddenly calmed down. The dual realm sky had already guessed that the world prison pagoda was in Yi Xian's hands, but no one made a move. Who would dare to move now? Yi Xian entered the sword world and then the sword world disappeared. However, Yi Xian walked out alive. It could be said that Yi Xian was currently the most dangerous person in the four-dimensional universe. There was no one else. Therefore, even if the people of the dual realm sky knew that the world prison pagoda was in Yi Xian's hands, they didn't do anything. Qingqing Yi Clan Ancestral Hall. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent and no virtue. From now on, Yi Xian's position as the crown prince will be replaced by Yi Lang. The person who spoke was an old man in a black robe. Not far behind the old man stood a youth with a faint smile on his face. This person was Yi Lang. On both sides were the Yi clan's elders. Why? At this moment, a somewhat timid voice suddenly rang out in the ancestral hall. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor and she looked a little weak. There was even a trace of fear in her eyes. This little girl was called Yi Ling, and she was Yi Xian's younger sister. When she heard that the clan wanted to remove Yi Xian, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned. Yi Ling, what are you doing? The little girl called Yi Ling bowed to the people in the ancestral hall, and said timidly, Great Elder, my brother Yi Xian is the crown prince. Why did you cripple him for no reason? The great elder looked coldly at Yi Ling. This is a matter of the clan, why are you interrupting? Yi Ling was obviously afraid, and did not dare to look directly at the great elder. However, she did not leave, and instead plucked up her courage to enter the ancestral hall. She once again bowed to the elders on both sides. Elders, my brother is fighting with the Li clan over the mining rights at Nanshan Hill. He is fighting for the clan, and it is unknown whether he is dead or alive. Yet, the clan is using a groundless excuse to strip him of his position. This is really unfair. Impudent. The great elder suddenly raged. Whether or not he is crippled, it is not up to a little girl like you to decide. Men, drag her away. At this time, the new crown prince Yi Lang suddenly laughed. You should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others. The great elder coldly replied, Then flog him 30 times. Very quickly, 2 Yi clan's guards rushed in. Yi Ling clenched her fists and said angrily, This is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the clan for so many years, and even now he is fighting for the clan. The clan is unfair to him. One of the guards glanced at the new crown prince Yi Lang. He knew that his chance to shine had come. The guard sneered, Young Master Yi Lang inherits the title of crown prince, and it is everyone's wish. What are you shouting for? As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. A crisp slap sounded, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly turned red and swollen. However, she did not cry and only clutched her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard and smiled. What's your name? The guard hurriedly bowed. Subordinate Zhang Mu greets the crown prince. Yi Lang nodded. You're not bad. After I become the crown prince, I will need 10 personal guards. From now on, you will be my personal guard. Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed and hurriedly bowed deeply. This subordinate is willing to go through fire and water for the crown prince, and I am willing to die 1,000 deaths. Yi Lang nodded. Drag him away. This person is causing trouble in the ancestral hall. Do not hold back. Understood? Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the killing intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. He immediately grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this time, Zhang Mu seemed to have seen something and he suddenly stopped. Within the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. He was dressed in a tight-fitting robe that was tattered and covered in blood. This person was Yi Xian, who had rushed back from the Nanshan. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's lips curled into a cold smile. Within the ancestral hall, all the elders were frowning. The great elder narrowed his eyes and his face was dark. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage. Who gave you the guts to touch my sister? When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian, his face changed. He quickly looked at Yi Lang and was about to speak, when Yi Xian suddenly leaped in front of him like a ferocious tiger. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Zhang Mu felt a wave of dizziness and he stumbled and fell. However, Yi Ling did not stop and he rushed towards Zhang Mu again. At this time, Yi Lang suddenly roared, Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you? Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly, while Yi Xian lifted his head to look at him, asking savagely, Your man? As he spoke, he stomped down on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess as he screamed, Prince, save me. Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's state, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being sliced by a knife. He clenched his fists and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, tears welled up in her eyes. Brother, it hurts, it hurts. Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage. In the next instant he charged in front of Zhang Mu and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Qingqing Yi Clan Ancestral Hall. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent, no virtue? From now on Yi Xian's position as prince shall be replaced by Yi Lang. The one who spoke was an old man in black robes. Not far behind the old man, there was a youth with a faint smile on his face. This person was Yi Lang. On both sides there were the elders of the Yi clan. What? Right at this moment, a slightly timid voice suddenly resounded within the ancestral hall. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor and she looked a little weak. There was even a hint of fear in her eyes. This girl was called Yi Ling, and she was Yi Xian's younger sister. When she heard that Yi Xian was to be replaced, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned. Yi Ling, what are you doing? The girl called Yi Ling bowed to everyone in the hall as she asked timidly, Great Elder, my brother Yi Xian is the prince. Why did you cripple him for no reason? The Great Elder looked at Yi Ling coldly. This is a matter of the clan, what are you interrupting for? Yi Ling was obviously afraid, not daring to look at the Great Elder, but she did not leave. Instead she plucked up her courage and walked into the hall. Once again she bowed to the elders. Dear elders, my brother is fighting with the Li clan over the mining rights at Nanshan. He is fighting for the clan, and it is unknown whether he is dead or alive. Yet, the clan is using a groundless excuse to strip him of his position. This is really unfair. Impudent. The Great Elder suddenly raged. Whether he's stripped or not, it's not up to a little girl like you to decide. Men drag her away. At this time the new prince Yi Lang suddenly laughed. He should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others. The Great Elder replied coldly, then flog him 30 times. Very quickly 2 Yi clan guards rushed in. Yi Ling clenched her fists and said angrily, This is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the clan for so many years and even now he is fighting for the clan. The clan is unfair to him. One of the guards glanced at the new prince Yi Lang. He knew that his chance to shine had come. The guard sneered, Young Master Yi Lang inherits the title of prince, and it is the wish of everyone. What are you yelling about? As he spoke he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. The crisp sound of the slap was heard, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly swelled up. However, she did not cry and only held her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard and smiled. What's your name? The guard hurriedly bowed. Subordinate Zhang Mu greets the prince. Yi Lang nodded. You're not bad. After I become the prince I will need 10 guards. From now on you will be my guard. Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed and hurriedly bowed deeply. Subordinate will go through fire and water for the prince and I will do anything for you. Yi Lang nodded. Drag him away. This person is causing trouble in the ancestral hall. Do not hold back. Understood? Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the killing intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. He immediately grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this time Zhang Mu seemed to have seen something and he suddenly stopped. Within the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. He was wearing a tight-fitting robe that was tattered and covered in blood. This person was Yi Xian who had rushed back from Nanshan. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's lips curled into a cold smile. Within the ancestral hall, all the elders were frowning. The Great Elder narrowed his eyes and his face was dark. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage. Who gave you the guts to touch my sister? When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian his face changed. He quickly looked at Yi Lang and was about to speak. At this time Yi Xian leaped in front of him like a ferocious tiger. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Zhang Mu felt a wave of dizziness and he stumbled and fell. Yi Lang did not stop there and he charged towards Zhang Mu again. At this time Yi Lang suddenly roared, Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you? Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly. while Yi Xian lifted his head to look at him, asking savagely, "Your man?" As he spoke, he stomped on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess as he screamed, "Prince, save me!" Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's state, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being sliced by a knife. He clenched his fists and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, tears welled up in her eyes. "Brother, it hurts, it hurts." Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage. In the next instant he charged in front of Zhang Mu and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Pum. Chapter 843. Yi Xian looked up and saw an old man slowly walking over from the horizon. The old man wore a loose black robe. His long hair was tied up and he held a horsetail whisk in his hand. There was a black mark between his eyebrows. At this moment, Emperor Shi walked over to Yi Xian's side and said softly, "Taoist Mountain Ghost. Very strong." Taoist Mountain Ghost looked at Yi Xian and smiled slightly. "Little friend, you have already destroyed his physical body. Can you give me some face and let him go?" At this moment, the soul-suppressing sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly flew out. In the distance, before the old bamboo staff man could react, the soul-suppressing sword pierced his eyebrows. The next moment, the soul-suppressing sword began to frantically absorb his soul. The old bamboo staff man was horrified. He wanted to resist, but how could he resist before the soul-suppressing sword? In less than a breath's time, the old bamboo staff man's soul was completely absorbed. Seeing this, Taoist Mountain Ghost's eyes narrowed slightly. However, the smile on his face did not diminish. Yi Xian waved his right hand and the soul-suppressing sword flew into his hand. Then he turned and left. Taoist Mountain Ghost was silent and did not make a move. He did not dare. In the past, no one had a true understanding of the strength of the person behind Yi Xian. But now, after the destruction of the Sword Sect, everyone understood. The Sword Sect, the #1 sect in the world, had been destroyed by Yi Xian. Who would dare to touch him? Even the big shots of the Dual Realm Sky were now afraid of Yi Xian. After a moment, Taoist Mountain Ghost shook his head. "This is the old bamboo staff man's own doing." After saying this, he turned and left. After a moment of silence, Emperor Shi also turned and left. Yi Xian did not leave the Dual Realm Sky. Instead, he went to find Minister Qin. Minister Qin looked at Yi Xian in front of him. "Little friend, that old bamboo staff man?" Yi Xian said, "Dead." "Dead." Minister Qin's expression stiffened slightly. After a moment, he nodded slightly and did not say anything. Yi Xian suddenly asked, "How do we go to the 5th dimension?" Minister Qin was slightly startled. The next moment he said with some excitement, "Little friend, are you going to the 5th dimension?" If someone else said that they wanted to go to the 5th dimension, he would definitely scoff at it. However, Yi Xian could go to the 5th dimension. The reason for that was because he possessed the World Prison Pagoda. Yi Xian nodded. "Yes." Grand Elder Qin smiled excitedly. He was about to speak when Yi Xian asked again, "Take me there?" Grand Elder Qin hurriedly nodded. "All right." Just like that, Yi Xian followed Pavilion Elder Qin upward. About 4 hours later, the two of them arrived at a starry sky. At the end of the sky was a barrier that was covered with mysterious runes. There were some corpses floating below the barrier. There weren't many of them, only a dozen or so. There were both men and women among these corpses, and they were all floating in the starry sky just like that. Looking at the barrier, Pavilion Elder Qin said softly, "Little friend, this is the barrier of the 5th dimension." Yi Xian looked at the corpses. "And these are?" Pavilion Elder Qin said in a low voice, "Powerhouses who have tried to break into the 5th dimension in the past." Yi Xian asked, "They all failed?" Pavilion Elder Qin nodded. "All failed. Some people's spiritual souls were destroyed, and their physical bodies didn't even exist. However, these dozen or so people were too strong, so their physical bodies were preserved, but their spiritual souls were destroyed." Yi Xian asked again, "How strong are they?" Pavilion Elder Qin thought for a moment, then said, "There are many Tao-breaking realm powerhouses among them." Tao-breaking realm. Yi Xian fell silent. Tao-breaking realm. This meant that Jinmu, Emperor Shi, and the other powerhouses were far from being a match for the corpses up there. It should be said that they couldn't compare at all. At that moment, Pavilion Elder Qin sighed. "Although we are all in the Dual Realm Sky, we know that it's too difficult to force our way through. This is also why the Dual Realm Sky and the Sword Sect have always been targeting Little Friend. Because for us, the 5th dimension's supreme treasure is really our last hope." Yi Xian said, "With my current strength, there's no hope for me to force my way through the fifth dimension, right? Pavilion Elder Qin nodded. Yes. He knew that Yi Xian was already very strong, but if Yi Xian wanted to force his way through the fifth dimension, it would be a dead end for him. Yi Xian nodded slightly, then turned and left. Pavilion Elder Qin was stunned, then hurriedly said, "Little friend, you're not going to the fifth dimension?" Yi Xian stopped. Pavilion Elder Qin, have you ever thought about it? Even if we use this thing to enter the fifth dimension, what then? Can we survive there? Pavilion Elder Qin was speechless because he had never thought about this. Previously he had been thinking about how to get there. Yi Xian said again, "If we go to the fifth dimension now, we'll be sending ourselves to death." Pavilion Elder Qin was silent for a moment, then asked, "Then we're not going?" Yi Xian looked at Pavilion Elder Qin. "We're going, but we're not taking a shortcut, we're going to force our way through." Force our way through. Pavilion Elder Qin looked at Yi Xian in shock. "Little friend, you're going to force your way through the fifth dimension?" Yi Xian nodded. Pavilion Elder Qin, send a message. If I, Yi Xian, want to go to the fifth dimension, I can use this thing to open a passage to the fifth dimension for you, but not now. I'm not strong enough right now, so I can't truly control this tower. Hearing this, Pavilion Elder Qin was a little excited, his voice trembling. Really? Yi Xian nodded. Really? However, during this period I'll need some help from you. It won't be too long, 3 years at most. Pavilion Elder Qin took a deep breath, then bowed respectfully. Within 3 years, little friend, if you have any requests, just let me know. Yi Xian nodded. Good. Now I need some swords. The higher the grade, the better. The more months, the better. Pavilion Elder Qin said in a low voice, "Little friend, don't worry. I'll get it done in a moment." Yi Xian nodded slightly. He looked up at the fifth dimension's barrier. This time he would rely on his own strength to go to the fifth dimension, not taking any shortcuts. A moment later, Yi Xian turned into a sword light and disappeared into the horizon. In the same place, Pavilion Elder Qin looked up at the fifth dimension's barrier. 3 years. He knew that with his strength, even if he went to the fifth dimension, he would still be cannon fodder. However, he still wanted to go and take a look. Moreover, who knew if he could go to the fifth dimension and have a new beginning? In any case, he could only live in the fourth dimension. Moreover, he didn't have much time left. 3 years. To him, it was just a snap of his fingers. Yi Xian came to the top of a mountain. He stood beside a cliff and slowly closed his eyes. Yiling. At this moment, his mind was filled with images of Yiling leaving the fifth dimension. In the past, he didn't really want to go to the fifth dimension. But now he had to go. He didn't care about the Shura Empress. He only knew that it was his sister Yiling. At this moment, Lian Qian suddenly appeared beside Yi Xian. She said in a low voice, "Ah, you found big sister." Yi Xian looked at Lian Qian. Big sister? Lian Qian nodded. She's our big sister. However, she said that she was delayed by something and couldn't find you for the time being. As she said that, she looked at Yi Xian. She also wants to see you. Yi Xian asked, "See me?" Lian Qian nodded slightly. She might be interested in you. Yi Xian said, "All right." Lian Qian said, "Let's talk about your sword skills, sword domain, and your sword intent. Your current sword domain is based on your sword intent. Therefore, the core of your sword domain is your sword intent." Yi Xian asked, "Are there swordsmen in the fifth dimension?" Lian Qian nodded. "Yes, there are many. However, the swordsman in the fifth dimension is different from the swordsman in the fourth dimension." Yi Xian was curious. "What's the difference?" Lian Qian said in a low voice, "The swordsmen in the fifth dimension cultivate the sword. However, they focus more on sword skills. Their sword skills are different from those in the fourth dimension. For example, your immeasurable sword. Actually, you don't really understand this sword skill." Yi Xian said, "I'd like to hear more about it." Lian Qian said, "Do you know why this sword skill can ignore realms, Tao laws and laws?" Yi Xian shook his head. Lian Qian said, "I can't explain it to you immediately. To put it simply, this immeasurable sword contains too much knowledge that your fourth dimension has never come into contact with. For example, after you execute the immeasurable sword, you will immediately enter the realm of emptiness. This realm of emptiness is actually a special kind of space. And this kind of space is an independent space that doesn't exist in the fourth dimension. To put it simply, even if the fourth dimension is annihilated, you can temporarily survive as long as you enter the realm of emptiness." Yi Xian was stunned, and then he said, "Then as long as I enter the realm of emptiness, won't I be invincible?" Lian Qian said indifferently, "Can you stay in that space forever?" Yi Xian shook his head. If he entered the realm of emptiness now, he could maintain it for an hour at most. Lian Qian said, previously you used sword domain, bloodline power, and immeasurable sword. You didn't use the Tao laws of space or the great Tao laws. Now try adding these two. Of course, don't use your bloodline power. She finally understood. Yi Xian's bloodline power was an existence that cheated. Of course, although this bloodline was powerful, it would also backfire. After all, if the Azura world hadn't forcefully suppressed him just now, he would have absolutely been unable to awaken. Yi Xian nodded when he heard Lian Qian, and then he slowly closed his eyes. It didn't take long for the spatial Tao laws and great Tao laws to appear between his brows. Bang! In an instant, the boundless energy of the earth veins in the surroundings converged towards him. Moreover, the space around him had started to gradually tremble as well. After a moment of silence, Yi Xian suddenly opened his eyes. A sword had suddenly appeared in the distant horizon, and there was a blood-red prisoner character on top of the sword. At the same time, a strand of mysterious energy had enveloped the surroundings. Sword domain, immeasurable sword, mantra of the 6 syllables, great Tao laws, spatial Tao laws. It could be said that the might of this sword strike of his wasn't inferior to the might of his bloodline power. Moreover, if he were to utilize his bloodline power as well, then its might would be even more terrifying. It was very strong. However, Yi Xian was very well aware that while this sword strike was very strong, it wasn't his true strength. This was a sword strike that had been constructed from all sorts of external objects. Yi Xian turned to look at Lian Qian and was about to speak. Suddenly, the sky split open and a bolt of lightning descended. This bolt of lightning arrived directly above Yi Xian and Lian Qian. Yi Xian and Lian Qian looked up and saw a middle-aged man standing within the bolt of lightning. The middle-aged man looked down at Yi Xian. I'm here to tell you that we've lost our patience. You and that woman behind you must die. P.S. Let's see if everyone can snatch another red packet. Give more this time. Chapter 844. Lost Patience. Yi Xian was silent. He knew that the person in front of him came from the 5th dimension and was not the real body. It should be a clone or an image. Lost patience. The opponent not only wanted to attack him, but also the plain-dressed woman. Yi Xian looked at the man. You guys can do it. After saying that, he turned and left. The man looked at Yi Xian coldly. 4-dimensional ant. As soon as he said that, his body gradually became illusory. Contempt. The look in the man's eyes was like that of a god looking down at ants on the ground. Arrogant? In fact, compared to the 5th dimension, the 4th dimension was really weak. In the eyes of the 5th dimension's experts, the 4th dimension was a group of barbarians without intelligence. However, they also admitted that there were powerful people in the 4th dimension. For example, the plain-dressed woman. They had already suffered a loss against the plain-dressed woman. Why did they suffer a loss? Because they were careless and did not understand. Now they had a rough estimate of the plain-dressed woman's strength. They were now confident. The man looked to his right, which was the direction of the sword world. Unfortunately, they had lost the sword sect as a chess piece. Without the sword sect as a spy, it would affect them quite a bit. Of course, the Shura Empress's appearance was something they did not expect. They naturally did not dare to find the Shura Empress, but Yi Xian and the others had no scruples. The man threw a cold glance in the direction where Yi Xian had left. Soon he disappeared completely. In the distance, Yi Xian slowly walked away. Beside him, Lian Qian softly said, "They should be making a big move. Not only against you but also against the plain-dressed woman." Yi Xian asked, "Will she be in danger?" Lian Qian solemnly said, "You should be asking if they will be in danger." Yi Xian stopped and looked at Lian Qian. Lian Qian softly said, "Even if Master was still alive, I'm afraid he would not be able to kill her. That woman was so powerful that she could not be reasoned with." Yi Xian was slightly puzzled. Then why are they still looking for her? Lian Qian bitterly smiled. Because they do not know her true strength, or in other words, they miscalculated her strength. When she spoke up to hear, she paused for a moment and said, "Actually, even I don't know her true strength." Yi Xian nodded. In other words, she will not be in danger. The one who will be in danger is me. Lian Qian nodded. Yes. Lian Qian nodded. Yes. Lian Qian was about to speak when Minister Qin walked over. He stopped in front of Yi Xian and smiled. "My young friend, the sword you wanted." Saying this, he handed a storage ring to Yi Xian. Yi Xian glanced at the storage ring. There were 30 swords in total. of Yi Xian. Yi Xian was rather shocked. Although these swords were not as good as the Retribution Heaven Sword Realm Soul Suppressing Sword, they could be said to be the best swords in this world. They would be of great help to him. Thank you. Elder Qin smiled. No problem. If you need anything, just let me know. Grand Elder Qin smiled and said, It's no big deal. If you need anything, just let me know. Elder Qin smiled. Don't mention it. If you need anything, just let me know. Pavilion Elder Qin said, Young friend, don't stand on ceremony. If it's within my capabilities, this old man will definitely not decline. Saying this, he glanced at Lien Qian. I will not disturb you too. Saying this, he retreated. Lien Qian asked softly, You want to break through to the life realm? Yi Xian nodded. My cultivation level is not high enough. Lien Qian shook her head. Yi Xian was puzzled. Why? Lien Qian said, You are too eager to break through. Haste makes waste and it will ruin your progress. Yi Xian asked solemnly, Then what should I do? Lien Qian thought for a moment and said, Change the method. Yi Xian asked, What method? Lien Qian smiled. Fight. Yi Xian frowned. Fight. Lien Qian nodded. Fight is the easiest way to stimulate one's potential. You need to fight to the death. Yi Xian asked, Who do you want to fight? Lien Qian thought for a moment and said, The experts of the five-dimensional universe. Yi Xian hesitated for a moment and said, Will I be killed? Lien Qian nodded. Maybe. Yi Xian was speechless. Lien Qian looked at Yi Xian. Are you afraid? Yi Xian shook his head. I'm not afraid, but, Lien Qian suddenly said, No buts. Let's go. Saying this, she walked into the distance. Yi Xian hesitated for a moment, but then he also followed. He knew that Lien Qian would not let him die for nothing. Not long after, Lien Qian brought Yi Xian to a starry sky. Above them was the five-dimensional barrier. Besides the barrier, there were also some floating corpses. In fact, Yi Xian wanted to take these corpses and refine them into demonic corpses. However, he was a little worried. It was not because he was benevolent, but because he was afraid that these people were not completely dead. If these people were not completely dead, it would be a little embarrassing if he went to attack their corpses. At this time, Lien Qian suddenly said, Do you see the five-dimensional barrier? Yi Xian looked at the five-dimensional barrier and nodded. What is it? Lien Qian said softly, Go. Yi Xian hesitated. Really? Lien Qian nodded. Really? Yi Xian thought for a moment and then turned into a sword light that soared into the sky. He did not hold back and directly used the immeasurable sword. Just as he was in the sky, a black lightning suddenly fell from the barrier. It was extremely fast and in the blink of an eye, it struck the sword light. Rumble. Following the sound of an explosion, a figure fell from the sky. Soon this figure crashed beside Lien Qian. It was Yi Xian. At this time, Yi Xian's whole body was pitch black and he could not stop trembling. On his body there were dense cracks. That strike just now had directly shattered his body. Although it was not completely destroyed, it was almost there. At the side, Lien Qian looked at Yi Xian with an expressionless face. The corner of Yi Xian's mouth twitched. Miss Lien Qian, this, Lien Qian asked, How does it feel? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Feels like dying is better than living. That attack just now had almost destroyed his physical body. His invincible sword physique could not even withstand a single blow from that lightning. Lien Qian suddenly said, Defeat it. Yi Xian looked at Lien Qian. Defeat that lightning? Lien Qian nodded. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, That's not possible. Just now he did not hold back, but he was killed in a second. What was the point of fighting? Lien Qian looked at Yi Xian. You have to understand that the enemies you will face in the future are many times stronger than this lightning. When you go to the fifth dimension, you are destined to challenge those of a higher level. And now, you must train to have the ability to challenge those of a higher level. Yi Xian was silent. Lien Qian said again, Moreover, it is not that you cannot defeat that lightning, but your method is wrong. Yi Xian frowned. Method? Lien Qian nodded. You should not take it head-on. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, Please enlighten me. Lien Qian said, You must learn to avoid its sharpness, find its flaws and kill it in one strike. Saying this, she looked at Yi Xian. In short, I don't care what method you use, you must defeat it. Yi Xian was silent for a moment, then nodded. I will try. Lien Qian shook her head. Not try, but try your best. Do your best. Understand? Yi Xian nodded. Do your best. Lien Qian said, Heal your injuries, then continue. Yi Xian took a deep breath. He took out some spring of life and began to absorb it. He looked at the black lightning above his head, still floating in the air. He had to admit that this black lightning was really terrifying. In his opinion, he would need to use the power of his bloodline, sword domain, and the 6 paths of truth to have a chance of fighting against this black lightning. But if he could defeat it like that, what meaning would it have? Yi Xian slowly closed his eyes. Lian Qian must have a deeper meaning for him to defeat the black lightning. It was not just a simple victory. Not far away, Lian Qian raised her head and looked at the 5th-dimensional barrier above her. Her eyes suddenly became somewhat vacant. Master, where are you? Speak cause and effect. Everything in this world has a cause and an effect. You created us. This is the cause, but where is our effect? Where should we go to find you? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.